Relaxation is nothing. That is what everyone knows. You lie down on the couch, you let your arms go heavy, your muscles fall silent, your breathing slows, and inside you the machinery quietly powers down like a factory at the end of a shift. The lights go off. The belts stop moving. Nothing is happening. To relax, in this picture, is simply to stop doing. It is the absence of effort. It is the empty space left behind when you finally quit clenching. Ask anybody. Ask yourself. When I say the word relax, you picture a body gone slack, a mind gone quiet, a whole person switched off. Doing nothing is the whole idea. That is completely wrong, and I think I can prove it to you slowly over the next few hours in a way that will change how you feel about your own body lying there in the dark. Let me start with the thing that first made me sit up. Some people took ordinary volunteers and slid them into one of those big machines that photographs the living brain while it works. And they gave them the easiest instruction in the world. They said, do nothing. Take this arm, this one arm, and simply let it go. Relax it. And they watch the part of the brain that runs your muscles, the strip of tissue right over the top of your head that fires whenever you move. You would expect it to go dark. You would expect that when a muscle is asked to do nothing, the region that commands it would fall quiet, would rest, would coast. Instead, it lit up. It blazed. It fired as hard as it fires when you clench that same arm with real force. And in some of the measurements, it fired harder to let go than to grip. Sit with that for a moment. Your brain does more work to release a muscle than to tighten it. Letting go is not the switching off of effort. Letting go is its own kind of effort, a second and separate act, and a more expensive one. So the couch picture is already in trouble, and we have barely started. Because if relaxation were truly nothing, truly the empty space where effort used to be, then there would be nothing there for a scanner to see. The screen would be dark. It was not dark. It was one of the busiest pictures those researchers had. And this is the little thread I want to pull on, gently, all night long, until the whole comfortable sweater of what you thought you knew comes apart in your hands and we knit something better in its place. Here is where we are going, so you can settle in and stop bracing for it. There is a technique, an old one, older than the machines that finally explained it. You tense a muscle. You hold it tight, hard, for something like 10 seconds. And then you let it go. And you move to the next muscle, and the next, working through your whole body, one piece at a time. Millions of people have been taught it as a way to calm down before sleep, and almost everyone who teaches it explains it wrong. They tell you it works by contrast. They say, well, you make the muscle tight so that when you release it, the looseness feels deeper by comparison, the way a room feels quiet after you finally turn off a noisy fan. That is a nice story. It is a comforting story. It is also, I am fairly sure, not the real reason, or at least nowhere near the whole of it. The real reason is buried inside your body in a place most students of anatomy walk right past. There is a tiny organ where your muscle joins its tendon, a little sensor stitched into the seam, and when you tense hard enough, for long enough, that sensor crosses a threshold and fires a signal. And the signal does not go up to your thinking brain to ask permission. It goes into your spinal cord and it comes straight back down, and it forces that muscle into a depth of relaxation you could never ever reach just by deciding to be calm. You cannot will your way there. You do not have a knob for it. But you have a trigger for it, and the 10-second tense is how you pull that trigger. The tension is not the medicine. The tension is the thing that unlocks the medicine. And the medicine is the release, the long, slow release, which is why, as we will see much later tonight, the release is deliberately made to last longer than the squeeze. And when you run this sequence, muscle by muscle, night after night, something measurable happens to the chemistry of your whole body. In one careful trial, 208 patients, people facing chemotherapy, people with every reason in the world to be flooded with stress, ran this exact practice daily for 3 weeks. And the stress hormone in their saliva, the one called cortisol, fell by nearly half. Not their mood, not their opinion of how they felt. The actual hormone, measured in a lab in a droplet of spit, cut close to in half, while in the group that did not practice it climbed the other way. So this is not a trick of the mind talking itself into comfort. Something physical is being turned, some real dial in the deep governor of the body, and we are going to find that dial and understand exactly how a person lying still in the dark, curling their toes, reaches down and moves it. But I do not want to give you the answer yet. That would be cheating, and worse, it would be boring. Because the honest way to understand why the old contrast story is wrong is first to understand why it is so believable. I want you to feel, for a while, the full pull of the wrong idea, so that when it finally cracks, you feel the crack. The people who believed the simple story were not fools. They were careful and clever, and the story they told fit almost everything they could see. That is what makes a good wrong idea dangerous. It works most of the time. It explains most of what you notice. It is only at the edges, in the strange measurements, in the picture that should have been dark and was not, that it quietly falls apart. So let us begin where they began, with the picture that feels airtight. Let us build up, in loving detail, the ordinary understanding of stress and calm. The top-down machine, the brain up in the tower pulling levers, and the obedient body far below doing as it is told. Let us make that picture as strong and as convincing as we possibly can. Let us make it feel like plain common sense, like something no reasonable person could doubt. And then, only then, once you are nodding along and comfortable and sure, I am going to start finding the loose threads one by one until the whole thing comes down and we discover that the body is not the servant in this story at all. The body has a vote. The body, it turns out, may be doing a great deal of the deciding. Get comfortable. You do not need to follow every word. If you drift off somewhere in the middle of the spinal cord, that is perfectly all right. That is rather the point. Let the ideas wash over you the way a tide comes in, one small wave at a time, each one reaching a little higher up the sand. Now, to build the wrong idea properly, we have to talk about what happens inside you when you are frightened. Not philosophically frightened, really frightened. A shape moves in the dark. A car swerves toward you. A voice says your name in a tone you have never heard before. In a fraction of a second, before you have consciously decided anything at all, your whole body changes state. Your heart pounds. Your palms go damp. Your breath quickens. Your muscles tighten and ready themselves. Blood leaves your stomach and your skin and pours toward the big muscles of your arms and legs and toward your brain. Sugar dumps into your bloodstream for fuel. You become, in a heartbeat, a different animal, a coiled and ready one. And all of this is orchestrated beautifully, automatically, by machinery you never see and cannot feel working. Where does the order come from? For a very long time the answer seemed obvious, and I want to give you that answer in its full and satisfying form, because it is genuinely one of the great pieces of biology and because you need to love it before I can talk you out of half of it. The order, they said, comes from the top, from a small knot of tissue deep in the center of your head. No bigger than the tip of your thumb, sitting just above the roof of your mouth, quietly running the entire show. It has an ugly name and a very grand job. And in the next stretch of our night together, I want to take you inside that little knot of tissue and show you exactly how it is supposed to command your body, hormone by hormone, nerve by nerve, so that you can see for yourself how complete, how closed, how perfectly top-down the ordinary picture really is. Because that picture is where every comfortable misunderstanding of relaxation begins. So let us go in there together. Imagine we could shrink ourselves down, the way children imagine shrinking to ride inside a raindrop, and float into the middle of the skull, into that little knot no bigger than a thumb tip. It has a plain and honest name if you take it apart. Hypo means under. The lumbus is the great relay station of the brain, the switchboard where the senses come in. So the hypothalamus is simply the thing that sits underneath the switchboard. And from that humble seat underneath everything, it reaches out and takes hold of two enormous levers. One lever is made of hormones and moves slowly, like molasses poured into a river. The other lever is made of raw nerve and moves in a flash, faster than you can flinch. Tonight I want you to hold both of those levers in your mind, one in each hand, because between the two of them they are supposed to explain every racing heart you have ever had. Let us take the slow one first, the molasses lever, because it is the more famous of the two. Deep inside the hypothalamus there is a little cluster of cells that the anatomist gave the name paraventricular nucleus, which only means the cluster that sits beside the little chamber of fluid in the brain. Never mind the name, what matters is what it does. When the alarm goes up, this cluster squeezes out a messenger molecule with a mouthful of a name. Corticotropin-releasing hormone. Let us just call it the first messenger. And this first messenger does not go far. It drips down a tiny private channel, a little stalk of tissue, into a gland that hangs underneath the brain like a cherry on a stem. That gland is the pituitary, and it is the size of a pea. So already you see the picture the old story wants you to love. The thumb tip whispers to the pea. Now the pea, having heard the whisper, does its own bit of shouting. It releases a second messenger into the bloodstream, and this one has a name we can shorten to 3 letters: A, C, T, H. And unlike the first messenger, this one travels. It rides the blood all the way down through the neck, down through the chest, down to 2 small caps of tissue that sit one on top of each kidney, like a pair of little hats. These are the adrenal glands. Add renal, again just plain Latin, meaning next to the kidney. And when the second messenger arrives and knocks on the door of the outer layer of those little hats, the outer layer answers by pouring out the hormone that everyone has heard of, the one we blame for so much of our misery: cortisol. Follow the chain again, slowly, the way you would trace a river on a map with your finger before you fall asleep. The thumb tip in the center of the head speaks to the P underneath it. The P speaks to the blood. The blood carries the word down to the little hats on the kidneys. The little hats release cortisol, and the cortisol goes everywhere, into every corner of you, telling your liver to unlock its stores of sugar, telling your body to hold its ground, keeping the whole emergency lit and burning. It is a chain of command, link after link, each one giving an order to the next. Physicists love a clean chain like this. It feels complete. It feels like something you could draw on the back of an envelope, and people did, and they were proud of it, and they had every right to be. But I told you the hypothalamus holds 2 levers, and the molasses one is only half the story, and honestly it is the slow and lazy half. Because a hormone poured into the blood takes minutes to do its work, and if a stone is coming at your head, you do not have minutes. You have a fraction of a second. So there is a second lever, the one made of raw nerve, and this one does not bother with the blood at all. It runs on wire. When the alarm goes up, the hypothalamus fires a signal straight down a set of nerves that thread down through the spine and out to the organs directly. No waiting, no messengers dissolving in the bloodstream, just a spark running down a line. And this spark reaches, among other places, the very center of those same little hats on the kidneys. The inner core this time rather than the outer shell, and squeezes out of them a flood of the fast chemicals. The ones people call adrenaline, the catecholamines. And now watch what that flood does. Because this is the part everyone recognizes from the inside, the part you have felt in your own chest 100 times without ever knowing its plumbing. The heart, which had been ambling along, suddenly picks up its pace and begins to pound. The vessels tighten and the pressure in them climbs, so the blood is not merely moving, it is being pushed hard. The liver flings open its pantry and dumps sugar into the blood, which is that lovely long word, glycogenolysis, the breaking down of the stored fuel called glycogen. And the blood itself gets quietly rerouted, pulled away from the places that can wait, the gut, the skin, and shoved toward the places that cannot wait if you are about to run or fight, which are the big muscles in the brain. That is why fear makes your stomach feel strange, and your face go pale, and your thoughts go sharp all at once. It is not poetry. It is a plumber, closing some valves and opening others. So there they are, the 2 levers, working together like a slow drummer and a fast one keeping the same beat. The nerve lever gives you the instant jolt, the pounding and the pressure and the rush, all in the first second. The hormone lever comes along behind it, slower, and keeps the fire fed for the long haul, the cortisol seeing to it that the emergency does not simply flicker out after a minute. Between the quick one and the slow one, the whole of your body's response to a threat seems accounted for, from the first flinch to the exhausted trembling an hour later. And every bit of it, every single link, traces back up the chain to that one small knot of tissue underneath the switchboard, deciding, commanding, running the show. I want you to sit with how airtight that feels. There is a decider at the top. The decider sends orders down, the orders arrive, and the body obeys. Nothing in that story asks the body what it thinks. The muscles in this picture are not participants. They are the audience. They are the last stop on the line, the place where the orders finally arrive and get carried out, the hands doing what the head has already decided. Blood is sent to them. Sugar is delivered to them. They are told to be ready. And they, being obedient tissue, tense up and wait. In this telling, a muscle is a puppet, and every string runs up, up to that thumb tip of a puppeteer in the dark center of your skull. And if that is true, then relaxation is the easiest thing in the world to explain, and it is exactly the boring thing we started the evening assuming it was. To relax on this picture, you simply have to get the puppeteer to stop pulling. Quiet the hypothalamus, and the first messenger stops dripping, and the pea stops shouting, and the little hats stop pouring, and the cortisol drains away, and the spark on the nerve lever goes dark, and the heart slows, and the vessels loosen, and the puppet, no longer told to be ready, goes limp. The muscles fall slack because the orders to be tense have simply stopped arriving. Relaxation, in the top-down story, is nothing but the silence that is left when the commander stops commanding. It is an absence. It is an off switch thrown somewhere far above the muscle, in a place the muscle cannot see and has no say in. Now I have built this up very carefully, and I have built it up honestly, because it is genuinely how the machinery works. I have not lied to you about a single link in either chain. The messengers are real. The little hats are real. The two levers are real, and if you cut any one of them, the response falls apart, so nobody is going to take them away from you. But I have arranged all of it on purpose to point in one direction, the direction of command from above, so that the ordinary picture stands in front of you looking complete and closed and unarguable. That is the belief I promised you at the start of the night, that relaxation is the absence of effort, and stress is a command from the top, and the muscle is just the place where the news finally lands. And here is the first small thing I want you to notice, the first little pebble in the shoe before we go any further. In everything I just described, the arrows only ever point one way, down. From the knot, to the pea, to the blood, to the hats, to the muscle. Never once, in that whole grand chain, did anyone draw an arrow pointing back up. Never once did the muscle get a vote. And yet, if you have ever, in a frightened moment, deliberately unclenched your jaw and felt the fear itself loosen its grip a little, then some quiet part of you already suspects that the muscle is not only listening, it is also, somehow, talking. Hold on to that suspicion gently as we go. We are going to follow it, slowly, all the way down to a man in 1908 with a very delicate amplifier who noticed something in his own numbers that did not fit this beautiful picture at all. So let me take you there, into a laboratory at Harvard University in the year 1908. There is a young man in that room, only 20 years old, and his name is Edmund Jacobson. He was born in Chicago in the spring on the 22nd of April, 1888, and he will live a very long life, all the way to the age of 94, before he dies in the winter of 1983. But right now he is young, and he is stubborn, and he is curious in that particular way that gets a person into trouble with settled opinions. He has built himself a machine, not a grand machine, a quiet one. What he has managed to do, and nobody had really done it properly before him, is to measure the faint electrical whisper that a living human muscle gives off when it is working. A muscle, you see, does not tighten in silence. When it contracts, tiny electrical signals ripple through it, and those signals are almost impossibly small. We are talking about voltages so tiny that most instruments of that day would never notice them at all. Jacobson built an apparatus sensitive enough to catch them. Low microvoltage, they called it. He was, in a real sense, the first person to eavesdrop accurately on the electrical chatter of muscle in a living body. Now think about what a strange and wonderful thing that is to be able to do. Before Jacobson, if you wanted to know whether a person was tense, you asked them. Or you watched them. You looked at the clenched hand, the stiff shoulders, the frown, but you were always on the outside, guessing. Jacobson put a number on it. He could look at his instrument and say, this muscle right now is carrying this much tension, and that one over there is carrying that much. He turned a feeling into a measurement. And once you can measure a thing, once you have honest numbers instead of impressions, the world starts telling you secrets it had been keeping from you all along. And here is the first secret his numbers told him. Whenever a person exerted themselves, whenever there was effort of any kind, the instrument showed the same companion every single time. The muscle fibers were shortening. Tension and exertion always walked in together, arm in arm, never apart. That sounds obvious once you say it out loud. Effort means the muscle pulls itself shorter. Fine, but watch where it leads. Because if tension is always the shortening of a muscle, then the opposite of tension is not some vague, peaceful mood floating in the mind. The opposite of tension is a specific, physical, measurable thing. It is a muscle fiber that has genuinely let go of its length. And that means relaxation stops being a feeling you have and becomes a state your body is in. A state you could point an instrument at and read off a dial. He did not stop with a single afternoon of measurements either. This was not a young man dashing off a clever result and moving along. He kept at it for 20 years. 20 years of patient work before he was willing to put the whole thing into a book. That book finally arrived in 1929, and he called it Progressive Relaxation, which is a very plain and honest title for a very careful piece of work. A few years later, in 1934, he wrote a friendlier version for ordinary people, and that one he called You Must Relax, which sounds almost like an order, and in a way it was. And later still, from 1936 all the way to 1960, he ran his own laboratory for clinical physiology back home in Chicago, spending decade after decade watching muscles let go and writing down what the instruments said. But I want to come back to that first crack, the one his numbers opened up, because it is the whole hinge of this story, and if you are drifting a little as you listen, this is the part to let sink in. Remember the tidy picture we built earlier. The brain up top, commanding. The body down below, obeying. Arrows pointing downward, always downward. Stress rolls from the mind into the muscle, and the muscle is just the last stop on the line, the place where the order gets carried out. In that picture, the muscle is a servant. It does what it is told, and it has nothing to say for itself. Now listen to the thing Jacobson wrote, a small sentence that seems almost too simple to matter. He said that people can be tense while they are resting, but they cannot be tense while they are relaxed. Read it once and it sounds like a play on words, a little riddle. Read it twice, and you see he has slipped a knife into the whole top-down story. Because think about what he is really claiming. He is saying that resting is not the same thing as relaxing. You can lie on your couch motionless, doing nothing, looking for all the world like the very picture of ease, and your muscles can still be quietly gripping, still firing off their little electrical complaints, still shortened, still working. Rest is a posture. Relaxation is a physical condition of the fibers themselves. A person can hold perfectly still and remain, on the inside, as tight as a fist. And that is a genuinely uncomfortable idea if you sit with it. It means that most of us, most of the time, when we think we are resting, are carrying a load we never agreed to pick up. The tension in the shoulders that you did not put there on purpose. The jaw you find clenched for no reason at all when you finally notice it. The forehead that stays furrowed long after the worry that furrowed it has been forgotten. Jacobson's instruments were seeing all of that, reading it right off the muscle in people who swore they were calm. The body was holding a grudge the mind had already let go of. Now, if the story were purely top-down, this would be a puzzle with no solution. If the only arrow points from brain to muscle, then a relaxed mind ought to produce a relaxed muscle automatically. Every time, no exceptions. Calm thoughts in, loose fibers out. But that is not what he found. He found people whose thoughts had moved on while their muscles stayed at war. The muscle was keeping its own state, running on its own clock, holding tension that the conscious mind had not ordered and could not simply think away. And if the muscle can hold a state the mind did not command, then the muscle is not only a servant. It has a little independence. It has a memory of its own. And a thing with its own memory can, in principle, send news back up the line. That is the loose thread. Pull on it, and the whole tidy sweater starts to come undone. Because now you have to ask a question that the top-down picture never had to face. If the muscle holds its own tension, and if that tension is a signal, an electrical, physical fact sitting in the tissue, then what is that signal doing? Where does it go? A tense muscle, remember, is a muscle that is doing something, and a body that is doing something is, at some level, a body preparing for something. The signals do not just sit in the arm politely waiting. They travel. And Jacobson had a hunch, decades before anyone could prove it with the fancy machines we will get to, that reducing the tension in the muscle did something to the whole nervous system. That when he coaxed a muscle to genuinely let go, not just to rest but to release, the activity in the central nervous system, the great switchboard itself, went down with it. Turned down the muscle, and the brain grew quieter too. Sit with the direction of that arrow for a moment. He was not saying calm the mind and the muscle follows. He was saying the reverse. Loosen the muscle and the mind eases. The tail, it seems, can wag the dog. And that is precisely the arrow that the beautiful top-down machine did not allow to exist. That arrow was not supposed to be there at all. Now I do not want to run ahead of the evidence, because that is exactly the sin the tidy story committed, and I would be a poor guide if I traded one confident tale for another without earning it. In 1908, and even in 1929, Jacobson had his numbers and his hunch, but he did not yet have the map of exactly how the muscle talks back. He knew that it did. He could see the correlation right there in his instruments, tension down, nervous system quieting. But the wiring diagram, the actual pathway, the physical road along which the muscle sends its report up to headquarters, that was still hidden. He was a man who had heard a voice through the wall and knew someone was there, without yet being able to open the door and see who was speaking. So the honest thing to do, the thing Jacobson himself would have insisted on, is to go looking for that pathway. If the muscle really does get a vote, there has to be a wire carrying the ballot. There has to be some real, findable piece of anatomy whose whole job is to notice what the muscle is doing, and to carry that news inward and upward into the spinal cord, into the brain. If we cannot find such a thing, then all of this is just a pretty correlation and we should be suspicious of it. But if we can find it, if there is truly a dedicated messenger sitting in the muscle whose entire purpose is to report tension back to the nervous system, then the whole picture has to be redrawn, and the arrows have to start pointing both ways. So let us go and find it. Let us go down, below the mind, below even the ordinary reach of the will, down into the place where the muscle joins the tendon, to a small structure that most students of anatomy glance at once and hurry right past. Because it is sitting there in every muscle you own, quietly doing exactly the job that Jacobson's numbers said something must be doing. And once you understand what it is for, you will never again believe that relaxation is simply the absence of effort. There it is, a little sensor woven right into the seam where the muscle fibers hand off their pull to the rope of the tendon. Anatomists gave it a name, the Golgi tendon organ, after the man who first drew it, and for a long time people were not quite sure what it was for. You might guess, reasonably, that it measures stretch. After all, it sits in a stretchy place. But that guess is wrong, and the wrongness is the whole point. It does not care how long the muscle is, it cares how hard the muscle is pulling. It is a tension gauge. It is a strain sensor bolted to the load-bearing part of the whole apparatus, and its single job in life is to answer one question over and over without ever getting tired of it. How much force is going through this tendon right now? Think about what a strange and clever thing that is. Your body did not build a sensor to feel the world outside. This one faces inward. It reports on you, on the effort you yourself are making. And it has its own private telephone line. From the Golgi tendon organ runs a nerve fiber, one of the fast ones, that carries this tension news straight into the spinal cord. The people who classify these things call it a type 1B afferent fiber, which is just a label, so let me tell you what the label means. Afferent means it carries signals inward, toward the center, toward the cord and the brain. That is the direction we care about. That is the direction the old top-down story swore was unimportant. And here is a fiber whose entire existence is devoted to sending information the wrong way, up the chain of command, from the muscle back to the spine. Now follow that fiber to where it lands. It comes into the spinal cord, and it does not go straight to the muscle to tell it anything. It first synapses onto a little middleman, a small nerve cell that sits between things, an interneuron. And this particular interneuron is an inhibitory one. Its whole business is to say no, to hush, to turn down. When the tension fiber fires hard enough, it wakes up this inhibitory interneuron, and the interneuron reaches over to the very motor neurons that are driving your muscle to contract, the ones sending the command to pull, and it clamps down on them. It tells them to be quiet. And the muscle, which a moment ago was straining, suddenly finds that the orders to strain have been cut off at the source. It lets go. The physiologists have a mouthful of a name for this. They call it the inverse myotatic reflex, or autogenic inhibition, and if those words slide right past you, that is fine, because the idea underneath them is simple and beautiful. A reflex is a loop that runs without asking the brain's permission. When the doctor taps your knee and your leg kicks, you did not decide to kick. The loop went from the tendon to the cord and back to the muscle before your thinking self even knew a hammer had touched you. Autogenic inhibition is a loop just like that, but running the opposite way. Instead of a tap producing a twitch, a hard sustained pull produces a release. The muscle, in effect, protects itself. When the force climbs high enough, the tension organ trips, the inhibitory cell fires, and the muscle is commanded, from below, from the spinal cord, to stand down. And here, gently, quietly, is the first crack in the old picture. Because notice what has not happened. The brain has not decided anything. The mind, the conscious will, the great commander at the top that supposedly runs the whole show, was not consulted. This is a decision made in the spinal cord, in the wiring beneath thought, and it can produce a depth of relaxation in the muscle that your will on its own simply cannot reach. You can try, lying there, to let your forearm go completely slack by wishing it slack, and it will get slacker, some. But there is a residue, a low background hum of tension that will not obey the wish, because the wish speaks to the muscle through one channel, and that quiet hum is being maintained through another. The reflex arc, though, the reflex arc can reach the hum. It has direct access. It can switch off the motor neurons in a way that pure intention never manages. So now we can see in outline why the recipe is shaped the way it is. Why do the instructions tell you to tense, and to tense hard, and to hold it? Because a limp little squeeze will not trip the gauge. The Golgi tendon organ has a threshold. It does not report every faint flicker of effort with equal alarm. It waits until the force through the tendon is substantial, and the rough figure people use is around 70% of the very hardest you could pull, held for something like 5 to 10 seconds. That is enough to push the tension past the threshold, to make the gauge fire strongly, to wake up the inhibitory interneuron and get it shouting its no down the line to the motor neurons. If you tense weakly, you never cross over. You are just fidgeting. The instruction to clench firmly is not there to make the contrast feel more dramatic against the rest that follows. It is there because there is a real physical latch, and you have to press hard enough to throw it. And why, then, is the release the long part? Here is a detail that the contrast story never explains, and once you notice it, you cannot unnotice it. In the recipe, the tensing is short and the letting go is long. You squeeze for a handful of seconds. But you are told to stay with the release, to linger in it, to give it far longer, at least 20 seconds, by the more careful reckonings, sometimes more. If relaxation were merely the absence of effort, the moment you stop squeezing you would be done. Off is off. There would be nothing to wait for. Why sit in the release for 20 long seconds when the muscle stopped contracting in the first half second after you let go? Because the reflex takes time to do its deepening work. The instant you release, the muscle is not at its floor. It has simply stopped pulling. But the autogenic inhibition, the quieting that came down from the spinal cord, keeps settling in, keeps drawing the muscle down past the level it held before you ever tensed it at all. That is the astonishing part, and I want to say it slowly. After a proper tense and release, the muscle does not merely return to where it started. it sinks below where it started. It ends up quieter than its own resting baseline, quieter than it was when you first lay down. The tension you provoked on purpose becomes the very thing that trips the switch that lowers the floor. And that settling, that sinking below baseline, is a process with a clock on it. It needs those 20 seconds. So the long unhurried release is not padding, and it is not psychology. It is the amount of time a spinal reflex needs to finish speaking. Sit with what that overturns. The whole comfortable idea was that tensing is just a setup, a foil, a dark background you paint so that the rest will shine brighter by contrast. But the tensing is not a foil. The tensing is the mechanism. You are not creating a comparison. You are deliberately loading the tendon hard enough to trip a sensor that most people go their whole lives never knowing they own, and that sensor, through a loop of wiring you cannot feel and did not authorize, reaches into the muscle and turns it down further than you ever could by asking nicely. The clench is not the problem you are contrasting against the solution. The clench is how you reach the solution. It is the key you turn. And notice, too, where this leaves the arrows. We came looking for a messenger. We asked whether there was truly some dedicated structure in the muscle whose purpose was to carry news of tension inward and upward, into the cord, into the nervous system. And we found it. It is not a metaphor, and it is not a maybe. It is a real organ with a real wire running the real wrong way from the body toward the center, and it is doing exactly the job Jacobson's careful little voltages hinted that something must be doing. The muscle is not only receiving orders, it is filing reports. The conversation runs both directions. The tendon speaks, and the cord listens, and the muscle obeys a command that never passed through the mind. Now, a spinal reflex is a humble thing. It is small. It happens in a few inches of nervous tissue near your backbone, and a skeptic could fairly say, "All right, you have shown me that one muscle can quiet one notch below its own resting state through a local loop. That is a nice little circuit. But you promised me the body could rewire how it handles stress. You promised me cortisol and heartbeats and the great alarm system of fear. A reflex in the spine is a long way from all that. And the skeptic would be right to press the point. One clever loop near the tailbone does not, by itself, calm a frightened animal. So the question has to grow. If the tension organ can talk to the spinal cord, can that quieting climb higher? Does the news stop at the cord, or does it keep traveling up past the neck into the great gray folds where fear is actually manufactured? Because if the message stops low, this is a party trick. And if the message goes all the way up, then we are looking at something much larger than a reflex, and the old picture is not merely cracked. It is finished. So let us follow the signal upward and see just how far into the machinery of the mind a quiet muscle can reach. So we go up, and the first place we arrive, following the wire from the tendon into the cord and then higher, is a great disappointment for anyone who loves a tidy story. Because for a long time, people assumed that when a muscle lets go, the brain simply stops talking to it. You give an order to squeeze, the brain shouts down the line, the hand makes a fist, then you stop shouting, and the hand falls open the way a puppet falls when you drop the strings. Relaxation in that picture is silence. It is the absence of a command. It is the brain going quiet and the arm going limp because nobody upstairs is bothering to send anything anymore. Now that is such a reasonable idea that almost everybody believed it, including some very clever people who really should have looked closer. And the trouble with a reasonable idea is that it feels finished. You stop poking at it. But somebody did poke at it, and the way they poked at it was to slide a person into one of those great humming machines that photograph the living brain while it works, and then ask that person to do the laziest thing imaginable. Not to lift anything, not to push, just to let a muscle go soft. And they watched the screen to see the brain fall quiet. It did not fall quiet. When the person deliberately released the muscle, the map of the brain lit up in the movement regions just as brightly as when they had clenched. In some cases, brighter. The primary motor cortex, that strip of tissue running over the top of your head like a headphone band, the part that is supposed to be the great sender of orders to move, was blazing away during the act of doing nothing. And right beside it, the supplementary motor area, the part that plans and sequences motion before you make it, was busy too. Letting go, it turns out, is not the brain hanging up the telephone. Letting go is the brain picking up a second telephone and placing an entirely different call. Sit with that for a moment, because it quietly overturns the whole cozy story. To relax a muscle on purpose is an action. It is a positive, effortful, organized thing the brain does, not a thing it stops doing. It is not the puppeteer dropping the strings, it is the puppeteer reaching in with a second set of hands and gently lowering the puppet down. And it costs something. It recruits territory. Alongside the motor regions, the scans showed the front of the brain joining in, the thoughtful part behind your forehead that weighs and decides, and the deep worried collar of tissue that helps you notice when something is off, and the old machinery down in the middle that smooths and times your movements, and the little dense cauliflower at the back that coordinates everything so it comes out graceful instead of jerky. All of that apparatus switched on so that a hand could go soft. Nature does not spend that kind of energy on nothing. If letting go were truly the absence of effort, none of those lights would be on. And once you know what to look for, the machine tells you something even stranger about the timing of it, because there are ways to peek at the split second before a muscle releases, to catch the brain in the act of preparing to let go, and to measure how excitable the movement pathway is from one instant to the next. When they did this, they found not one event, but a little sequence, a tiny piece of choreography that happens faster than you can possibly feel it. Somewhere around 80 to 100 thousandths of a second before the muscle actually softens, a kind of internal brake comes off inside the cortex. There is a system in there whose whole job is to hold movement back, to keep a lid on things, and that lid lifts first. A gate of restraint quietly opens. Then, a hair later, 60 to 80 thousandths of a second before the release, comes a curious little flare. The pathway from brain to muscle becomes briefly more excitable, not less. There is a small spike of readiness, a flash, as if the system takes a sharp breath. And only after that, only after the brake lifts and the flare passes, does the real thing happen. The line from brain to muscle goes quiet, and not just ordinary quiet. It drops below where it sat when you were merely resting. The pathway becomes calmer than its own baseline, quieter than doing nothing at all. Isn't that a strange little dance to find hiding inside something as dull as unclenching your jaw? First you release the brake, then you flare, then you sink below where you started. It is the exact opposite of a puppet strings going slack. It is an act with a beginning and a middle and an end, performed by the brain in a fraction of a heartbeat every single time a muscle lets go on purpose. And here is the thing that should make you sit up, if you were the sort to sit up while trying to fall asleep. That final state, the pathway sitting below its resting level, means the brain does not return you to where you began. It sets you down somewhere lower, somewhere quieter than the place you were in before you ever tensed. The tensing was not the point. The tensing was the running start. The quiet on the far side is the destination, and it is a deeper quiet than rest. Now, if that were the whole of it, we would have a fine story about one muscle and one little patch of cortex. But the scanners found something that refuses to stay in one place. When they had a person relax a single limb, say the muscles of one forearm, the calming did not politely stay put. It spread. The regions governing the other limbs on the same side went quieter too, their motor chatter suppressed, even though those limbs had done nothing, had been given no instruction, were just lying there. And in the forearm territory of the cortex, that internal system of restraint, the very lid we spoke of, grew stronger across the neighborhood. One deliberate release in one place sends a hush rolling outward across the map, the way a single person sitting down in a restless, murmuring crowd can make the people nearby lower their own voices without quite knowing why. So you begin to see the shape of the thing. You tense one fist and let it go, and you have not performed a local trick on one bundle of fibers. You have dropped a stone of quiet into a pond, and the rings travel. This is why the old method walks you through group after group, the forehead, then the eyes and cheeks, then the jaw, then the neck, the shoulders, the chest, the arms, the hands, the belly, the hips, the thighs, all the way down to the feet. It is not simply that you are checking off body parts like items on a grocery list. Each release is another stone, another set of rings, and the ripples overlap and reinforce until the whole surface of that inner pond has gone still. The sequence is not a chore, it is a way of quieting a very large crowd one section at a time, until the entire hall falls silent, and the silence it reaches is below the level of ordinary rest. And this is the moment where the reasonable old idea does not merely crack, it comes apart in your hands. Because the reasonable old idea said the brain commands and the body obeys, top to bottom, general to soldier, and relaxation is just the general going quiet. But look at what the machine actually showed us. Relaxation is the brain performing a deliberate, effortful, spreading act. The body is not just receiving orders, something is being organized, and it is being organized in the direction of calm, and it does not stay local, and it leaves the whole system lower than it found it. The general is not falling silent, the general is conducting. Which raises a question that the old pitcher never had to face and cannot answer. If letting go is an action the brain takes, and if that action leaves the motor pathways quieter than rest, then where does the settling stop? We have climbed from the tendon to the spinal cord to the great sheet of the cortex, and at every level we have found not silence, but activity bending toward quiet, and quiet that spreads. But the motor map is only the part of the brain that moves you. It is not the part that frightens you. The alarm, the real alarm, the racing heart and the flood of hormones, and the cold, clean feeling of dread that lives deeper and older instructs the motor cortex only borders. So the ripples are traveling. The pond is going still. The question now is whether the stillness can cross the last boundary, out of the machinery that plans your movements and into the machinery that decides whether you are safe. Because if a quiet muscle can reach that far, if the hush can pass from the parts that move you into the parts that fear for you, then we are no longer talking about relaxation at all. We are talking about a message sent upward from the body that tells the oldest and most frightened part of the brain to stand down. And to see whether that message truly arrives, we have to stop watching the muscles and the motor maps and turn instead to the strange fact that most of the wiring in the great calming nerve of the body does not run the way everyone draws it. So let me tell you about that nerve, because it is one of the great surprises of the body, and almost nobody has it drawn correctly in their head. The great calming nerve, the one that wanders down out of the base of the skull and touches the heart, and the lungs, and the gut, and half the soft machinery of your insides. When people picture it, they picture a set of orders going down. The brain, up in its throne, sending instructions to the organs below. Slow the heart. Ease the breathing. Loosen the belly. Arrows pointing down, always down, the general shouting to the troops. But go and count the fibers. Actually count them, the way a patient anatomist would, one bundle at a time. And you find something that ought to stop you cold. Roughly 8 out of every 10 fibers in that nerve are not carrying orders down at all. They are carrying reports up. Up from the body, up into the brain. The traffic is almost entirely in the wrong direction if you believe the story about the general and the troops. It is not a general shouting down. It is a vast crowd of messengers running upward, breathless, each one carrying a small note about how things are down below. The heart is beating so. The lungs are filling so. The gut is calm, or the gut is clenched, and only a thin trickle of fibers runs the other way, carrying anything you would call a command. Sit with that for a moment, in the dark. The nerve everyone thinks of as the brain's way of soothing the body is mostly the body's way of telling the brain what is going on. The organs are not just listening, they are talking constantly, and the brain is mostly listening back. So when we ask whether a quiet muscle can send a message upward, past the motor maps into the old frightened core, we are not asking for some rare and exotic pathway. We are asking whether one more messenger in a crowd already running upward can be heard. And the wiring says the upward road is wide open. It is, in fact, the main road. Now put the muscle back into the picture, because the muscle too is a talker, not just a doer. Threaded all through it are little sensors, coiled inside the fibers, that do nothing but report on stretch and tension. We met their cousins earlier, the tension sensors at the tendon. These are the ones inside the belly of the muscle, the spindle sensors, and they never shut up. As long as a muscle holds any tension, they are firing, sending a steady stream of signals up the spinal cord and into the brain. Here is my length. Here is how hard I am pulled. Again and again and again, a heartbeat drumming that never rests while the muscle is even a little bit tight. And the brain, down in its old cautious basement, treats that drumming as information about the state of the world. A body braced is a body that has some reason to be braced. You do not clench your shoulders and your jaw and your belly for no reason. Somewhere in the long history of animals that survived, a tight body came to mean a dangerous moment. So the steady chatter from all those tension sensors is not neutral noise. It is read at some level far below your thinking as a low hum of threat. Not loud, not a scream. Just a background murmur, always there, saying be ready, be ready, be ready. And most people carry that murmur all day long and never once notice it, the way you stop hearing a refrigerator until the moment it clicks off. So now watch what a single tension release actually does to that murmur. You take a muscle and you pull it hard up towards 7 parts in 10 of everything it could give, and you hold it there while the sensors shriek. And then you let go. And in the letting go, the tendon reflex we talked about drives the muscle down below where it started, quieter than its own resting quiet. And all those spindle sensors that were drumming their steady be ready, go soft. The chatter drops. For that muscle, in that moment, the murmur of threat falls silent. One small refrigerator has clicked off, and for the first time you can hear how loud it had been. Do that to one muscle, and the effect is small, a single voice going quiet in a choir. But the sequence does not stop at one. It walks the whole body. The forehead, then the eyes and cheeks, then the jaw down through the neck, across the shoulders and the back, into the chest, along the arms and out to the fists, then the belly, the hips, the long muscles of the thighs, the calves, and finally the feet. One by one, each group is pulled tight and let go, and one by one, each group's private murmur of threat falls still. You are not relaxing, in the lazy sense. You are going through the body like someone walking through a house at night, room by room, switching off the lamps that were left burning. And when enough of them are dark, the whole house is dark, and the quality of the darkness is something the basement of the brain can feel. Here is where the 4 steps I want you to hold in your mind begin to turn, one into the next, like a line of dominoes leaning into each other. The first step you have just seen. The proprioceptive quieting. The muscles stop sending their steady signal of tension, and the brain stops receiving that low background report of a body under strain. That is the first domino, and it falls the moment the release phase deepens past the old baseline. The second domino sits in a tangled knot of cells deep in the brainstem, an old switchboard that helps decide from moment to moment how aroused you ought to be. It is a place that weighs incoming signals and tips the balance one way or the other, toward the branch of the nervous system that revs you up, or toward the branch that lets you rest and digest and heal. That switchboard is not making some grand decision from principle. It is tallying up the traffic. And a great part of that traffic is exactly the muscle chatter we just hushed. When the body was drumming its be ready, the tally leaned toward the revving branch, toward the racing side. Take the drumming away, quiet room after quiet room, and the tally shifts. The balance tips, gently, away from the branch that prepares you to fight or flee and toward the branch that slows the heart and softens the gut. Nobody up top gave an order. The vote simply came in different because the voters had changed their tune. And notice, this fits the strange fact about the great nerve, the one running mostly upward. Of course, a shift down in the body can tip a balance up in the brain. The road was built for it. The body was always meant to have a voice in the matter. We just forgot, because it flatters us to imagine the mind on top issuing decrees and the flesh below obeying. The truth is humbler and far more interesting. The flesh is forever murmuring upward, and the mind is forever leaning down to listen, and the state of your muscles is one of the loudest things it hears. The third domino is the one we watched fall earlier when we looked at the scalp and the scrolling waves. Once the switchboard tips, the whole electrical weather of the cortex begins to change. The fast, jagged rhythms of an anxious, watchful brain start to thin out. The smoother, rounder rhythm of a calm and easy alertness begins to swell and spread. And later, if you stay with it, an even slower and deeper rhythm drifts in across the front of the head, the kind that shows up when a person is truly, profoundly at ease. That is not a mood arriving by magic. That is the cortex retuning itself to a body that has stopped shouting. The recalibration follows the quieting. The way the sea goes glassy some minutes after the wind has died, not the instant it dies, but soon and unmistakably. And the fourth domino is the one we have been circling this whole while, the one that matters most, the reason any of this is worth doing at all. Down in the almond-shaped knot deep in the brain, the little sentinel whose whole job is to sniff the air for danger and pull the alarm, the pressure begins to ease. Not because you reasoned with it. You cannot reason with it. It does not speak the language of reasons. It speaks the language of signals, of incoming evidence about whether the world is safe. And what has been happening, step by step, domino by domino, is that every channel feeding that sentinel has begun at the same time to carry the same quiet news. The muscles say we are not braced. The switchboard says the balance has tipped toward rest. The cortex says the weather is calm. From every direction the evidence arrives, and it all agrees, and it all says the same simple thing. There is no emergency here. And the sentinel, which cannot be argued with but can be shown, is finally being shown. And slowly, grudgingly, the way a frightened animal lowers its hackles only when the whole field has gone still, it stands down. That is the crossing we asked about. That is the message reaching the last boundary. Out of the machinery that moves you and into the machinery that fears for you. And it did not cross by climbing over the wall of the motor cortex. It went around, through the body, up the wide road of the great nerve, riding on the silence of 1,000 hushed senses, until the oldest part of the brain looked at the incoming evidence and could no longer justify the alarm. You lay still and curled your toes and let them go, and somewhere far below your knowing, a sentry that had been standing at attention for years finally sat down. And to understand just how deep that sitting down goes, and why doing it once is nothing but doing it again and again, is everything. We have to look now at what the body is actually keeping score of, and how that score gets written not in a single evening, but in the slow arithmetic of weeks. Let me take you into a room I want you to picture very plainly. It is a ward where people are getting chemotherapy, which is about as hard a thing as the body is ever asked to endure. Fear lives in a room like that. And somebody had the good sense to ask a simple question. If you teach these patients to lie down and tense and release their muscles group by group, and then to picture something calm, does the fear leave a chemical trace that we can catch? Because you can talk about calm all day long, but the body does not lie in the same way the mouth does. There is a hormone called cortisol, and it seeps out into your saliva, and you can measure it in the morning with nothing more than a little swab. Cortisol is the slow river of the stress system, the one that keeps flowing long after the fast fright has passed. So they measured it. They took 208 people. Half of them learned the practice. 2 minutes of breathing, then 10 minutes of the tensing and releasing, then 15 minutes of picturing a quiet place. Every day, for 3 weeks. The other half did not. And here is what the swabs showed. In the group that practiced, the morning cortisol started at about 0.3. In the little unit they use, nanograms in each milliliter of saliva, and by the 3rd week it had fallen to about 0.16. Call it a drop of nearly half. Now hold that number in one hand for a moment, because a number alone means very little. You need something to compare it against, and that is what makes this beautiful. The other group, the ones who got the ordinary care and no practice, their cortisol went the other way. It climbed. It started lower, around 0.21, and it rose all the way to about 0.44. Their river was rising while the other river was falling. Same ward, same disease, same fear in the air. The only difference was that one group had learned to speak to the body in the body's own language. When the people who do statistics for a living looked at how big that separation was, they got a number that made them sit up. They call it an effect size, a way of asking whether a result is a whisper or a shout. A small effect might be 0.2, a middling one 0.5, This one came out at about 0.99. That is a shout. That is the kind of gap you almost never see in soft, human, hard to measure things like mood and hormones. And it was not only the chemistry. They also asked the people how anxious they felt on a careful questionnaire, and the two groups pulled apart there too. The practices came down from about 45 to about 39. The others went up from about 39 to about 44. Two groups, starting close together, walking away from each other in opposite directions over 3 short weeks. You could almost watch the fork in the road open up. Now I want you to be a little suspicious with me here, because I would be. A person could say, well, of course they felt better. You gave them attention. You had them lie down in a quiet room and picture a beach. Anyone would relax. Maybe the tensing and the releasing had nothing special to do with it. Maybe it was just the rest, the quiet, the kindness. That is a fair objection, and a good scientist does not wave it away. A good scientist goes looking for a study designed to catch exactly that cheat. And there is one. Somebody strapped heart monitors onto 21 perfectly healthy adults and followed them for 77 days while they went about their ordinary lives. Not in a lab, out in the world, walking around. And they split them into groups. One group did the muscle practice 3 times a week, about 18 minutes a session, guided by a recording. Another group did a breathing exercise instead, the kind where you slow your breath down to a special rhythm. And there was a plain control group as well. Now the thing they were watching is a lovely little measurement. When your heart beats, it does not tick like a metronome. The gap between one beat and the next is always shifting. A tiny bit longer, a tiny bit shorter, breath by breath. And strangely, more wobble is better. A heart that varies is a heart under the calm hand of the resting nerve, the great wandering nerve that tells you all is well. A heart that beats with rigid sameness is a heart being driven by alarm. So they measured the wobble. They have a name for the particular measure, a mouthful of letters, but all it means is the beat-to-beat variation, the size of the flutter. And here is the part that answers our suspicious friend. The muscle group's wobble went up. Their resting nerve got stronger, measurably, by an amount the statisticians were willing to stake their name on. But the breathing group, the ones doing the slow special breath, showed essentially nothing. Their number barely twitched. So it was not simply relaxation in general. It was not simply lying down and being guided by a soothing voice, because the breathers had all of that too. It was something particular to the tensing and the releasing, something the breath alone did not deliver. That is the kind of result that tells you you have hold of a real thread and not a comfortable illusion. The specificity is the fingerprint. When one method moves the needle and a very similar method does not, you are no longer looking at wishful thinking. You are looking at a mechanism. And if you follow that thread up the arm, so to speak, it reaches the most stubborn organ of all, the one that will not be fooled by mood or belief, the blood pressure. There was a study of 64 people whose pressure was too high. They split them into groups of 16. One group did only the muscle practice and nothing else for 4 weeks. Now, blood pressure is a hard thing to move gently. It is the standing weight of the whole circulation, the push of the river against its banks. But it moved. The top number, the pressure at the peak of the heartbeat, came down from about 149 to about 145. The bottom number, the resting pressure between beats, came down from about 91 to about 88. Modest, you might say. And it is modest. But it is real. It is measured in the least suggestible tissue in the body, and it happened with no pill, no needle, nothing entering the person from outside. It happened because a person lay down and tightened and let go, and the banks of the river eased. And when they combined the muscle practice with slow breathing, the top number came down further still, toward 143, and even the resting heart rate slowed, from about 76 beats a minute to about 72. Sit with what that means. You have a body that a moment ago we described as a top-down machine, the little knot of tissue up in the brain barking orders down the chain, the hormone river and the fast nerves obeying. And here is a person changing the standing pressure in their own arteries from the bottom up by doing nothing that the old pitcher would even recognize as an instruction. No decision reaches the heart directly. You cannot simply will your blood pressure down by wanting it. But you can tighten your calf and release it, and your fist and release it, and your jaw and release it, group after group. And the pressure in your arteries drifts downward as if you had reached in and turned a valve you were never supposed to be able to touch. You did not touch it with your will. You touched it through the muscles, up the wide road of the nerve into the old brain, and back down the slow chemical river. You went the long way around, and the long way around turned out to be the only road that actually goes there. Now here is where I want to be honest with you, the way I would want someone to be honest with me, because a lecture that only tells you the triumphs is not teaching you, it is selling you something. When people gathered up all the studies of this practice, dozens of them, and looked at them together with a cold eye, they found a soft spot. Many of those studies leaned on what people said about themselves. Questionnaires. How anxious do you feel? On a scale. And people's reports of themselves are precious, but they are also slippery. Only a smaller number of the studies reach for the hard, unarguable measures, the hormone in the saliva, the wobble in the heartbeat, the electrical hush in the muscle, the waves on the scalp, and more than a third of those studies had fewer than 40 people in them, which is a small crowd to build a mountain on. So the picture is not finished. The chemistry we have looked at tonight, the cortisol falling by half, the effect that shouted instead of whispered, that is the strong timber in the structure. But there is scaffolding still up, and honest builders leave the scaffolding visible until they are sure. I tell you this not to weaken what came before, but because the truth is more interesting than a sales pitch, and because the gaps are where the next 20 years of discovery are hiding, waiting for someone patient enough with a good enough amplifier. But grant me the strong timber, because the strong timber is enough to change how you think about yourself. The hormone fell. The heart's wobble grew. The pressure in the arteries eased. And every one of those things was measured in the morning, or across weeks, not in the 90 seconds while the person was lying there squeezing their hands. Which raises the question that will carry us the rest of the way. If the calm you build tonight has faded from your muscles by tomorrow noon, how does the hormone still come out lower 3 weeks later? Something is being kept. Something is being written down and carried forward, night after night, in a ledger we have not yet opened. The single evening is a candle. The 3 weeks of evenings is a slow fire that warms the stones themselves so that even when the flame is out, the hearth stays warm. And to see how the body keeps that warmth, how a thing you do and then stop doing leaves a mark that outlasts the doing, we have to look at what it means to teach a nervous system a habit it can no longer forget. So let us think, gently, about what a habit even is, in the language of nerves and muscles. When you learn to ride a bicycle, nobody hands you the equations of balance. You wobble, you fall, you wobble a little less, and one afternoon the wobbling simply stops and the bicycle feels like part of your legs. Nothing was written on paper. Something was written in you. The pathways that fired together over and over grew easier to fire together until the hard thing became the automatic thing. That is the deepest kind of learning there is, the kind that lives below words in the wiring itself. And I want to suggest to you softly that lying in the dark curling your toes is exactly this kind of learning. You are not resting. You are practicing. You are riding a bicycle made of your own quieting. Here is the piece of evidence that first made me sit up. In people who have done this tensing and releasing for a long while, for weeks and weeks, something strange happens. They no longer need the tensing at all. They can drop into the calm state, the real one, the one with the lower hormone and the slower brain waves, in under 60 seconds using nothing but a cue, a word to themselves, a breath, a memory of what the release felt like. The whole elaborate staircase of 16 muscle groups, forehead down to the feet, folds up into a single step. Think about what that means. The first night, you needed the full machinery. You needed to clench each muscle at roughly 70% of what it could do, hold it, feel the tendon organ trip its little switch, wait the 20 long seconds for the release to sink below where it started. All of that, night after night. And then, at some point, the body says, I know this road now. You do not have to drive me through every turn. Just tell me where we are going. That is the ledger opening. That is the thing that gets carried forward while the muscle itself forgets. The muscle relaxes and by morning tightens again with the ordinary business of living. But the pathway that produced the relaxation, the route from intention to quiet, has been traveled so many times that it has worn smooth. And a worn smooth path is easier to take the next time, and the time after that, until taking it, becomes the natural thing your nervous system does when you ask. Now I want to be careful and honest, because this is where it would be easy to wave my hands and tell you a pretty story. So let me tell you what we actually have. We have that recall finding, and I will say plainly it rests on softer ground than some of the other numbers we have talked about. It is the kind of result we hold loosely, with interest, not the kind we pound the table about. But it does not stand alone. It leans against something sturdier, something Jacobson himself measured with that sensitive amplifier of his all those years ago. Remember what he found. Reduce the tension in the muscle, and the activity in the central nervous system goes down with it, measurably, on the meter. The body and the brain are not two separate machines shouting across a gap. They are one machine, folded over on itself, each half feeding the other. And if that is true, then chronic tension is not just a feeling. It is an input. It is a signal sent up continuously that never quite stops. Here is a fact that ought to unsettle you a little, in the gentle way that good facts do at night. Somebody went and measured the resting tension, the just sitting there tension, in two particular muscles. The one across your forehead, the frontalis, and the one that runs like a yoke across the top of your shoulders, the trapezius. The muscles that clench when you are worried without your ever deciding to clench them. And they asked, how well does the tightness in these muscles right now at rest predict how anxious a person is? And they compared it against the usual things we trust, against what people said about their own stress, against how well they slept, against the tally of hard things that had happened in their lives lately, the divorces and the deaths and the lost jobs. And the muscle tension won. The reading off the forehead and the shoulders predicted the anxiety better than the person's own account of their stress, better than their sleep, better than the list of their misfortunes. Sit with that. We are so used to thinking the mind is the cause and the body is the readout. The worried mind, we assume, tightens the shoulders, and the tight shoulders are just a symptom, a smoke that tells you where the fire is. But if the tightness predicts the trouble better than anything the mind can report about itself, then perhaps the shoulders are not only smoke. Perhaps they are, in part, the fire. Perhaps the tension is not merely reporting the anxiety. Perhaps it is helping to make it. And now the whole thing turns over in your hands like a stone you have been carrying the wrong way up. Because if chronic tension is an engine that helps drive the distress, then every night you spend teaching your muscles to release below their old baseline, you are not just feeling better for an evening. You are reaching in and turning down the engine. You are lowering the resting signal that goes up the 80% of vagal fibers that run body to brain, up through the quieting of those spindle afferents, up into the part of the brain that decides, minute by minute, whether the world is safe. You change the message the body is sending, and because the body is voting upward all the time, all day, whether you attend to it or not, changing that vote changes the tally the brain keeps. This is how the candle becomes the slow fire in the stones. One evening lowers the signal for an evening. But the pathway learns. The muscle's resting length, over weeks, settles a little lower. The road to calm wears smooth, and the brain, receiving a quieter report from the body day after day, gradually revises its standing estimate of the danger you are in. It is not that any single night rewrites you. It is that the nights accumulate, each one a small deposit in that ledger, until the baseline itself, the place the whole system rests when nothing in particular is happening, has moved. That is what the 3-week cortisol number was showing us all along. Not the calm of the 90 seconds, the calm of the moved baseline. The hearth that stays warm because the stones themselves have finally taken the heat. I said I would be honest with you, and honesty cuts both ways, so let me tell you where this story is still thin. Because a good idea deserves to be held up to the light, and not just admired in the dark. When people gathered together the many studies of this practice, dozens of them, and looked hard at how the calm was actually measured, they found something sobering. Most of the time we asked people how they felt. We handed them a questionnaire. Rate your anxiety from this number to that number. and people said they felt better, and they said it consistently, which is not nothing. But only a smaller handful of studies went and measured the hard things, the things the body cannot fib about. The hormone in the saliva, the wobble in the heart, the waves off the scalp, the markers of inflammation in the blood, and more than a third of these studies were small, fewer than 40 people in them, which means the ground under some of our confidence is softer than we would like. I tell you this not to take the warmth away. I tell you this because the honest version of a wonderful thing is more durable than the oversold version, and it will still be standing when the hype has blown off. What we can say firmly is this. When somebody did put the electrodes on and the saliva in the tube, the needle moved the right way, and sometimes it moved a great deal. The skin conductance sliding steadily down through a session, that continuous readout of the sympathetic nerves letting go, does not care what you write on a questionnaire. The hormone falling by nearly half in the chemotherapy ward does not care. The heart's wobble growing over the 77 days does not care, and it grew for the tensing group and not for the mere breathing group, which tells us it was something about this practice in particular and not just about lying quietly with good intentions. Those are the load-bearing stones. The rest is scaffolding we have put up around them, and some of that scaffolding may yet come down. But notice what even the honest, cautious version leaves standing. It leaves standing the strangest thing of all, the thing we set out to explain. A person does something for 10 seconds, then stops. Does it again, then stops. Climbs the little staircase of muscles and comes back down. And then gets up and walks away and goes about an ordinary life. And weeks later, on a morning when they are not tensing anything, not thinking about any of this, a chemical in their spit comes out lower than it would have. The doing is gone. The mark remains. And that is only possible because the nervous system is not a thing that responds and forgets. It is a thing that responds and learns. It keeps score. It carries the lesson of last night into the shape of tomorrow. So when we ask how the candle becomes the fire in the stones, the answer is the plainest and the deepest thing about you. You are built to be taught, and a body that can be taught to be calm is a very different thing from a body that must simply wait, helpless, to be rescued from its own alarm. Think for a moment about what it means to keep score without meaning to. You do not decide to remember how to ride a bicycle. You simply ride it badly a few times and wobble, and one afternoon the wobble is gone and it never comes back. Nobody signed a contract. Nobody wrote it down. The knowing got folded into the meat of you, into the wiring, into the automatic part that acts before you can name what it is doing. And what we have been circling around all this long evening is that calm can be learned in exactly the same silent way, not as a mood you summon, as a skill you install. The tensing and the letting go are the wobbling on the bicycle. The lower number in the spit, weeks later, is the day you found you could just ride. Let me stay with the sequence itself for a while, because I have been treating those 16 little muscle groups as a list, and a list is a cold thing, and this is not a cold thing at all. Picture the climb. You begin high at the forehead, that broad sheet of muscle you use to lift your eyebrows in surprise. You squeeze it and let it fall. Then the eyes and the cheeks. Then the jaw, which for so many people is clenched half the day without their permission. Down through the neck, across the back and the shoulders, where the whole weight of worry likes to perch, into the chest, along the upper arms, out to the hands where you make a fist and open it, then the belly, the hips, the great muscles of the thighs, and at last down to the calves and the feet, where you curl the toes and release them into the dark. You have walked down your own body like someone going through a house at night, room by room, turning off every light that got left burning. And here is the part that the old contrast story never understood. It is not that each dark room simply feels darker next to the bright one you just left. It is that each muscle, as it goes quiet, stops shouting. Remember those little reporters buried in the muscle, the spindle afferents, the ones labeled with the letters and that never stop sending their signal up the wire. In a tense body they are all talking at once, a steady murmur of readiness flowing up into the brain, and the brain, hearing that murmur, quite reasonably concludes that something out there must be worth being ready for. Why else would the body be braced? So when you release the forehead, one section of that murmur falls silent. Release the jaw, another section goes quiet. By the time you have curled and uncurled the toes, you have not simply relaxed 16 muscles. You have switched off, one by one, 16 separate voices that were all whispering the same word up the wire. The word was danger, and a brain that stops hearing the word over and over from every corner of the body at once begins, cautiously, to entertain a different idea. The idea is safety. It arrives not as a thought, but as an absence, the absence of that upward murmur it had been listening to all day. Now I want to be honest with you about something, because it would be easy at this hour with the lights low to let me sell you a miracle, and I have never had much patience for miracles. When people gathered up all the careful studies of this practice, more than 30 of them, and laid them side by side to see what they truly showed, they found something a little uncomfortable. Most of those studies had asked people how they felt. They handed out questionnaires. They asked on a scale, how anxious are you? How well did you sleep? And they wrote down the answers. And the answers were good. The answers said people felt better. But a questionnaire is a soft thing. A person who has just spent 20 minutes with a kind voice guiding them through a calming exercise might well write down a cheerful number simply to be polite, or because they hope it worked, or because hoping it worked is itself a kind of relief. Only a smaller number of those studies did the harder thing, the colder thing, and measured the body directly. The spit, the heartbeat, the electrical hum of the muscle. And more than a third of all these studies had fewer than 40 people in them, which in this business is a small and easily fooled crowd. I tell you this not to knock the thing down. I have spent the whole night building it up, and I meant every plank of it. I tell you this because the strongest reason to believe in something is that it survives your honest doubt. And this one does. Because where the studies did reach past the questionnaire and touch the body itself, the body agreed. The salivary cortisol did not care about anyone's manners. It simply fell. The heartbeat's variability, measured across 77 days, did not know it was supposed to be polite. It simply rose. The blood pressure in those 64 people with stubbornly high pressure did not read the questionnaire. It came down and stayed down for the 4 weeks they watched. When the soft measures and the hard measures point the same direction, you are usually looking at something real. It is when the person says they feel wonderful and the instruments say nothing changed that you should reach for your coat and leave. And there is one more measurement I have been saving, because it turns the whole argument inside out in a way I find quietly astonishing. Suppose you wanted to predict how anxious a person is. You could ask them. You could hand them the questionnaire about their stress. You could ask about their sleep and about the hard things that had happened to them lately, the losses and the moves and the money troubles, the whole inventory of a difficult life. All of that seems like it ought to tell you who is suffering. But there was a better predictor than any of those. It was a small electrical reading taken from 2 muscles at rest, from the muscle in the brow and from the muscle across the top of the shoulders. Just the resting hum of those 2 muscles, measured while the person did nothing at all, told you more accurately how anxious they were than their own account of their own life. Sit with that. The body was keeping a more truthful record of the person's distress than the person could give in words. The shoulders knew before the mouth did. The brow had already confessed what the tongue would still deny, which means the muscle was never only downstream of the trouble. It was not merely a place where anxiety showed up after the fact, like mud tracked in from a storm that happened somewhere else. The tension in that shoulder was part of the storm. It was one of the engines keeping the weather going. And if it is an engine, then reaching in and stilling it is not mopping the floor after the rain. It is reaching up and turning off a piece of the machine that makes the rain. That is the whole revolution of this idea in a single sentence. The thing you were told was a symptom turns out to be in part a cause. And causes are the only things worth grabbing hold of, because a symptom you can only wait out, but a cause you can change. There is a last gift in all of this that I have only hinted at, and it is the gift that makes the word rewiring more than a pretty flourish. In the beginning, you need the whole ritual. You need the 10 seconds of squeezing and the long, slow release, the full climb down the staircase of the body, because that is how you teach the reflex what calm feels like from the inside. But a nervous system that learns does not need to relearn the same lesson forever. After enough nights, after the pairing has been made again and again between the letting go and the quieting, something remarkable becomes possible. The body begins to answer to a cue alone. A practiced person can drop into that lowered state, with real changes in the cortisol and real changes in the brain waves, in under a single minute without squeezing a single muscle. They have built a shortcut. They have laid down a private path from a simple thought, a remembered feeling, straight to the machinery of calm, bypassing the whole long ceremony that first carved the path. The tensing was the scaffolding. Once the arch of stone can stand on its own, the scaffolding comes down, and what remains is a bridge you can cross in a moment, any time the alarm starts to ring. So the beginner does the full labor, and the veteran barely lifts a finger, and both are doing the same deep thing, only one has done it so many times that the doing has worn a groove. This is why I keep returning to the word taught. You are not medicating yourself when you do this. You are not borrowing a calm from outside and paying it back with interest when it wears off. You are practicing the way you would practice a scale on a piano until your fingers find the keys in the dark. And the calm you build this way belongs to you completely, because you made it out of nothing but 10 seconds of effort, and the patience to let go slowly, and the willingness to do it again tomorrow. The instrument was in you all along. Tonight you have simply been learning, gently, in the quiet, which of your own strings to pluck, and how and in what unhurried order to make the whole trembling thing at last fall still. Let me take you somewhere I have been circling but have not yet let you sit inside, which is the heart itself. Because the heart is a wonderful gossip. It cannot keep a secret. Whatever your nervous system is really doing, underneath all your opinions about how calm you are, the heart tells on you. And the way it tells on you is not through how fast it beats, which is what everybody watches, but through something subtler, the tiny wobble in the spacing between one beat and the next. A heart under the whip of the sympathetic system beats like a metronome, rigid, evenly spaced, because it is being driven. A heart that is safe, a heart with a parasympathetic branch murmuring to it, beats a little loose, a little jazzy, speeding on the breath in and easing on the breath out. That looseness has a name. The researchers measure it and call it heart rate variability, and one particular flavor of it they call RMSSD, which you do not need to remember except as this. Higher means calmer. Higher means the vagus is doing its quiet work. Now somebody strapped monitors to 21 healthy adults and followed them for 77 days. Not an afternoon in a laboratory. 77 days of ordinary life. Walking around, working, worrying about whatever people worry about. One group did progressive muscle relaxation, 3 sessions a week, roughly 18 minutes each, guided by a recording. And their heart rate variability, that loose jazzy looseness, went up measurably in a way the statisticians were willing to sign their names to. The number they reported was a beta of about 0.1, with a probability that this was a fluke of only about 2.5 in 100. Small, honest, real. But here is the part that made me sit up. They had another group, and that group did a breathing exercise, the kind tuned to a special slow rhythm that is supposed to ring the whole cardiovascular system like a bell. Resonance frequency breathing, they call it. Good technique. Plenty of people swear by it. And in this particular study, over these particular 77 days, its effect on that heart looseness was essentially nothing. A beta of 0.01, with a probability that made a statistician shrug and look away. So the tensing and releasing did something the breathing did not. I am not telling you breathing is useless. I would never say that, and one study is one study. I am telling you that whatever the muscle work is doing, it is not merely the generic warm bath of relaxing. It is its own specific lever pulling on its own specific rope, and the rope runs straight to the wandering nerve and the ancient balance beam in the brainstem we spoke of earlier. The blood pressure people found the same fingerprint. Take 64 adults whose pressure was running high, the kind of number a physician frowns at, systolic sitting up around 149, 150. Have them do the muscle work, only the muscle work, nothing else, 4 weeks of it. The top number came down from about 149.5 to about 144 and 8/10. The bottom number, the diastolic, the pressure in the quiet moment when the heart is filling, came down from about 91 to about 87.5. And when they added slow breathing on top of the muscle work, the top number fell further still, down to around 143, and the heart rate itself eased from about 76 beats a minute to about 72. These are not miracle numbers. Nobody threw away their medicine, but they are real millimeters of mercury, moved by nothing but a person lying still and clenching and unclenching in a deliberate order, and the odds against these being accidents were less than 1 in 10,000. I want to be the honest partner here, because I promised you I would be, and because a lecture that only shows you the wins is a salesman, not a scientist. So let me hand you the doubt along with the delight. In the year 2025, somebody gathered up 32 studies of this muscle work done with people who had trouble breathing, lung disease, the aftermath of that respiratory illness that swept the world. And on the surface, the results were lovely. In one group of recovering patients, the anxiety score, measured on a standard scale, fell from about 55 down to about 39. In another, sleep quality, measured on a well-known index where a high number means miserable nights, dropped from nearly 11 down to 4, which is the difference between staring at the ceiling and actually sleeping. And when they pooled the numbers together, they found the anxiety improvements were large and the mood improvements were large enough to matter to a real person in a real bed. And then the same reviewers, to their great credit, turned around and told on themselves. Most of those 32 studies, they admitted, leaned on what people said about themselves. Questionnaires. How do you feel? On a scale of 1 to 4. Only a handful bothered to measure the hard physical things. The saliva cortisol, the brain waves, the heart looseness, the inflammatory chemicals in the blood. And more than a third of the studies had fewer than 40 people in them, which in the world of clinical evidence is a small candle to read by. So the honest picture is this. The subjective story is strong and consistent. People feel better reliably across dozens of studies. The objective story, the story written in molecules and voltages, is promising and pointed in the same direction, but it is thinner, built on fewer shoulders, waiting for the big, careful experiments still to come. That is not a weakness in the idea. That is simply where the frontier actually sits tonight, and I would rather you fall asleep knowing where the frontier is than dreaming that everything is settled. Yet even the doubters have to reckon with the skin. Because the skin, it turns out, is another organ that cannot keep a secret, and it lies much less than a questionnaire. When your sympathetic system fires, your sweat glands answer. Not enough to see, just enough to change how easily a tiny electrical current crosses your palm. Electrodermal activity, they call it. It is a direct readout of the sympathetic branch moment by moment, and it does not care what you claim to feel. So somebody took 60 undergraduates and compared 3 things: the muscle work, plain deep breathing, and picturing peaceful scenes. And the muscle work, along with the peaceful imagery, produced a smooth, steady downhill slide in that skin conductance across the whole session. A straight line easing down, which is exactly the shape you want, the shape of a sympathetic system quietly withdrawing its hand from the controls. The deep breathing, interestingly, did a different dance. It spiked up first, a little jolt of arousal, and only then came down. Not worse, necessarily. Just different. Different rope, different lever, different fingerprint again. The heart rate in that study drifted the right way, but did not quite reach the bar the statisticians had set, a probability of about 8.5 in 100, close, but not close enough to bank. And that, too, is honesty. The muscle work does not win every measure every time. It wins the ones tied most tightly to the sympathetic dimmer switch, which is precisely what the whole spinal and cortical story predicts it should. There is one more finding I have been saving, because it is the one that quietly rearranges how you think about the whole business of anxiety. We tend to believe that the mind is the cause and the body is the symptom. The worry comes first, we assume, and the tight shoulders are just the smoke off that fire. But somebody measured the resting tension, the idle electrical hum, in 2 particular muscles, the one across the brow and the big one draping the top of the shoulders and neck, the trapezius, the muscle that creeps up toward your ears when the day goes wrong. They measured that hum in people at rest, doing nothing, not asked to tense anything. And that resting muscle hum predicted how anxious a person was more accurately than the person's own report of their stress, more accurately than how well they slept, more accurately than a checklist of the hard things that had happened in their life. Sit with that a moment. The tension in the muscle was a better prophet of the anxiety than the anxiety's own testimony, which means the body is not downstream of the trouble. The body is holding one end of the rope. And if you can persuade that idling muscle to fall genuinely silent, not slack, not merely resting, but silent in the deep way the tendon reflex allows, you are not treating a symptom. You are letting go of one end of the rope. And a rope pulled from only one end cannot stay taut. So when you lie there tonight and work through them, the brow, the eyes, the jaw, the neck, the shoulders, one patient region after another, understand what the numbers are whispering underneath the whole procedure. You are not performing a relaxation ritual and hoping your mind takes the hint. You are reaching down into a loop that has two ends, the mind's end and the body's end, and most techniques only ever tug politely at the mind. You have found the other handle, the one made of tendon and spindle and reflex, the one the worry never learned to guard, and you are easing it loose, thread by thread, in the dark. Let me sit with that rope a little longer, because there is something in it worth turning over slowly. A rope pulled from one end only cannot stay taut. But a rope has a second property we have not yet touched. If you keep working it, loosening it, letting it go slack and then loosening it again, night after night, the rope itself begins to remember the loosened shape. It stops springing back so hard. The fibers of the thing take a set. And this, I think, is the part of the story that surprised even the people measuring it. Because the first time you lie down and go through the 16 regions, you are doing a great deal of work to coax the muscle past its own reflex, to cross that threshold of tension and wait the long 20 seconds or more for the tendon organ to do its quiet arithmetic. But the 20th time and the 50th time, something has changed in you that was not there at the start. Here is what the people watching the cortisol found. In practiced hands, the whole apparatus can be summoned without the clenching at all. A person who has done this faithfully for weeks can lie down, and simply by recalling the feeling, by cueing the body the way you might hum the first bar of a song and have the whole tune arrive unbidden, they drop into the relaxed state in under a single minute. The saliva shows it. The brain waves show it. No fist, no bracing of the calf, no long theatrical sequence, just the recall, and the body obeys as though the reflex had already run. Now think about what that means. The tense and release was never the point. The tense and release was the teacher. It was the way you taught the nervous system a route it did not know it had, and once the road is worn in, you can travel it without the map. That is the rewiring the whole thing is named for, and it is not a metaphor borrowed to make you feel better. It is a conditioned pathway, learned the way a hand learns a doorknob in the dark. I want to be honest with you now, because a careful person always tells you where the ground gets soft. When the reviewers gathered up the studies, all 32 of them, and laid them side by side to see what we really knew, they found something a little uncomfortable. Most of those studies leaned on what people said about themselves. Questionnaires, scales where you rate your own worry from one number to another. And self-report is not nothing. But it is not the same as a saliva sample or a heartbeat traced across 77 days. Only a limited number of those studies reached for the hard, objective markers, the heart rate variability, the brain waves, the cortisol, the inflammatory signals in the blood. And more than a third of the studies had fewer than 40 people in them. 40 people is a small crowd to hang a certainty on. So what do we do with that? We do not throw the whole thing out. That would be foolish, because where the hard measures were taken, they pointed the same way as the soft ones. The cortisol fell where the questionnaires said calm had risen. The heart rate variability climbed where people reported ease. When two very different instruments, one made of chemistry and one made of confession, agree with each other, you start to trust the direction they are pointing even before every last study is large and airtight. But you hold it honestly. You say, the physiology is real, and the effect where measured is often large, and also the field still owes us more of the hard measurements and bigger crowds. Both things are true at once. A grown-up science lives comfortably with that sentence. Let me give you the picture that I find hardest to shake. the one that reorganized how I think about the whole business of being wound tight. There was a finding, tucked in among the rest, about the muscles you are not even thinking about. The trapezius, that broad sheet across the top of your shoulders and up into your neck. The frontalis, the muscle of the brow, the one that furrows when you frown. When they measured the resting tension in those two muscles, the tension sitting there quietly, while a person believed themselves to be doing nothing at all, that measurement predicted how anxious the person was. And here is the part that ought to stop you. It predicted the anxiety better than the person's own account of their stress, better than how they rated their sleep, better than a careful inventory of the hard things that had happened in their life, the losses and the moves and the deadlines. Turn that over. We tell ourselves the story of our own strain from the top down. We say, I am tense because of this deadline, this argument, this bill. We locate the cause in the events and the thoughts. But the muscle, sitting there in the shoulder, keeping its low, steady hum of contraction that the person had entirely stopped noticing, that muscle knew the truth of the matter more accurately than the person's own testimony. The body was not reporting on the anxiety. The body was, in some real measurable degree, holding it, producing it, feeding it back up the 80% of vagal fibers that run from the body toward the brain, feeding it up the spindle afferents. A small constant telegram that says some effort is required here, some readiness, some guarding. And the brain, receiving that telegram all day long, does the sensible thing. It stays a little braced. It keeps the threat detector warm. That is why the old comfortable picture had to fall. Not because the top-down machinery is wrong, the hypothalamus and its hormones are exactly as real as they ever were, but because it was only ever half the wiring. We had drawn all the arrows pointing down from the brain into the obedient body, and we had forgotten or never bothered to draw the thick bundle of arrows pointing the other way. The body is not merely the place where stress is spent. The body is one of the places where stress is generated and sustained, and where, if you know the trick, it can be quietly switched off at the source. And notice how gently the switch actually works, because this is the loveliest part. You do not have to argue with your worry. You do not have to reason yourself calm, which anyone who has lain awake at 3 in the morning knows is a fight you usually lose. The worry is clever, and it has 100 answers ready for every reassurance you offer it. But the worry does not know anything about the Golgi tendon organ. It never learned to guard that door. When you contract the calf hard for those several seconds and then let it fall, the tendon organ fires its inhibitory message into the spinal cord, and the little interneuron does its work, and the motor neurons to that muscle go quiet, and none of that requires your worry's permission. It happens below the level where the arguing lives. You have gone underneath the conversation entirely and reached the wiring directly with your hands, or rather with the muscles themselves. So the person lying there in the dark, curling the toes and letting them uncurl, is doing something far stranger and far more mechanical than they realize. They are not soothing themselves in the way you soothe a child with soft words. They are operating a reflex arc. They are deliberately tripping a spinal circuit that evolution installed to keep muscles from tearing themselves off the bone, and they are borrowing that circuit for a purpose evolution never intended, to reach up through the whole ascending traffic of the nervous system and tell the brain, region by patient region, that the body has stood down. The brow reports safety. Then the eyes. Then the jaw, which we clench without ever noticing. Then the neck, the shoulders where the trapezius kept its secret hum, the chest, the arms, the hands, the belly, the hips, the long muscles of the thigh, the calves, and last the feet. 16 small telegrams of safety sent up the same wires that all day carried the low telegram of guarding, and the reticular formation, that meshwork deep in the brainstem that is forever weighing the incoming traffic and deciding whether to tip you toward alarm or toward ease, receives less and less of the guarding signal as you go. With the proprioceptive noise dying down region by region, the balance it strikes tips, slowly, away from the sympathetic readiness and toward the parasympathetic rest. Not because you commanded it, because you changed the evidence it was working from. You quieted the witnesses that had been testifying all day that something was required of you. And with those witnesses quiet, the amygdala, the small almond of threat detection, has less and less reason to keep sounding its low alarm, and it too settles, down-regulated not by a thought, but by the sheer converging weight of pathway after pathway, all reporting the same thing at once. Safe here. Safe here. Nothing required. You may stand down. That convergence is the whole secret of why it bites deeper than talking yourself calm ever could. A single reassurance is one voice. But this is the spinal reflex and the ascending vagus and the spindle afferents and the reticular balance and the brainwave composition all shifting together, in the same minutes, in the same direction. It is not one argument for calm. It is a dozen instruments retuning to the same key, and the brain, which is above all else a machine for reading its own body, cannot easily disbelieve a dozen honest instruments at once. Let me take you now to a quieter piece of evidence. Quieter because it makes no sound at all, only a scrolling line of ink or light. Put some little electrodes on a scalp, harmless things, just listening, and watch what the electricity of the brain does across one of these sessions from beginning to end. At the start, before the first fist is ever clenched, you tend to see a great deal of what people call high beta, the fast rhythms up around 20 to 30 cycles every second. That fast chatter is the signature of an anxious, watchful arousal, the mind riding its brakes and its accelerator at the same time. It is the electrical weather of a person who is resting but not relaxed, and I want you to notice that those are two entirely different countries, because Jacobson told us so long ago, and here it is written in the trace itself. Then the session gets going. Group by group the muscles are tensed and let go, and the fast beta does not vanish all at once. Nothing in the body is that theatrical. It fades. It thins out, the way a crowd noise thins as people drift home, and rising underneath it, gaining ground minute by minute, comes a slower, rounder rhythm alpha, somewhere between 8 and 13 cycles a second. Alpha is the rhythm of calm alertness, of a mind that is awake and easy, not asleep, not frightened, simply at rest inside itself. So you are literally watching one kind of electricity trade places with another, watching the anxious fast weather give way to the calm slow weather, and it happens on a clock you could almost set your watch by. And if you keep watching, into the later stretches of the session, something even slower begins to show itself up at the front of the head. Theta waves, slower still, emerging across the frontal regions. That frontal theta is a pattern people have learned to associate with the deep end of relaxation, the state you are drifting toward right now perhaps as I talk. So there is a kind of descent written into the whole record. Fast to medium to slow, beta yielding to alpha yielding to theta. Not a switch thrown, but a tide going out, one rhythm handing the shore to the next. And remember the corticospinal excitability we spoke about, the readiness of the line from brain to muscle. After the release phase, that readiness settles below where it sat before you ever began. The baseline itself has dropped. You did not merely return the machine to idle, you lowered the idle. The engine now ticks over more softly than it did when you lay down, and that, more than any single relaxed muscle, is the fingerprint of a genuine recalibration. Now, I can already hear a certain kind of listener, the honest skeptic, the one I like best, saying to me, that is all very pretty, all these waves and reflexes, but show me it matters. Show me a number in the blood, not a squiggle on a chart. Fair. That is exactly the right thing to demand, and it happens we can answer it. Let me take you to a place nobody wants to visit. A ward where people are facing chemotherapy, about as much stress as a body can be handed. 208 of them in a proper trial split into groups. One group was taught this practice, a little breathing, then the muscle work, then some guided imagining, and they did it every day for 3 weeks. The others were not, and they measured cortisol, the stress hormone itself, right out of the saliva, first thing, where it cannot lie to you. In the group doing the practice, the cortisol fell from about 0.30 nanograms per milliliter at the start down to about 0.16 by the 3rd week. That is close to a 47% drop, nearly cut in half, in people whose circumstances were, if anything, growing more frightening by the week. And the ones who were not taught the practice? Their cortisol did not hold steady. It climbed from about 0.21 up to about 0.44, more than doubling, which is exactly what you would sadly expect as the treatment ground on. So the two groups did not merely differ. They marched in opposite directions, one hormone falling as the other rose, and the gap between them by the end was enormous. When the statisticians measured the size of that effect, they got a number around 0.99, which in that trade is what you call a very large effect indeed. Not a whisper, not a hint, but a shout. And it was not only the hormone. They also asked these people with a careful questionnaire how anxious they felt inside. The practicing group's anxiety scores came down from around 45 to around 39. The others climbed from around 39 up toward 44. Once again, opposite directions. So the thing you can measure in the spit and the thing the person feels in the chest move together, downward, in step, exactly as the old bidirectional story says they must. Quiet the body and the mind reports back that it feels safer. Frighten the body and the mind agrees to be frightened. The blood and the feeling are not two separate accounts. They are one account, read in two different currencies. I want to be scrupulously fair here, because that is the only way this is worth doing. That was breathing and muscle work and imagining, all braided together, so a careful person cannot say the muscle part alone did all of it. Good. Hold on to that honesty. But now let me hand you a study built precisely to test whether the muscle part carries its own weight. 21 healthy adults, wearing heart monitors as they went about their ordinary lives, for 77 days. Some did the muscle practice 3 times a week, about 18 minutes a time. And the thing being watched was a measure of the heart's variability, the tiny natural unevenness in the spacing between beats. It sounds like a flaw, that unevenness, but it is the opposite. A heart that varies richly from beat to beat is a heart under the calm, flexible hand of the parasympathetic system. A metronome heart, rigidly even, is a heart braced for trouble. The muscle group's variability went up, significantly, more parasympathetic tone, more of that flexible calm woven into their days. And here is the part that makes me sit up. There was another group in that same study doing a particular style of slow, tuned breathing, the resonance breathing people speak so highly of. That group showed no significant change in this measure at all. None to speak of. So this was not the generic magic of lying still and being told to relax. It was specific to the tensing and the releasing, specific to the muscles being made to speak and then made to fall silent. The reflex arc retraced, the tension organ at the tendon, the release drifting the muscle below its old floor, that machinery left its mark on the heart in a way mere gentle breathing, for all its virtues, did not. And blood pressure obeys the same story. Take 64 people carrying high pressure, that quiet grinding load on the vessels. The ones who did only the muscle practice, no drugs added, no other tricks, brought their upper number down from around 149 to around 145 over 4 weeks, and the lower number down from around 91 to around 88. Small figures to say aloud, I know, and yet across a whole population those small figures are the difference between vessels that hold and vessels that fail, and they were bought with nothing but the deliberate curling and uncurling of muscle done faithfully, day upon day. Add some slow breathing to the muscle work and the pressure came down further still, the pulse itself easing from around 76 beats a minute towards 72, the heart choosing of its own accord a gentler pace. So look at what we have gathered, lying here in the dark. A reflex in the spinal cord that no thought can command, a gate of disinhibition that opens in the cortex a breath before a muscle lets go, a nerve whose fibers run mostly upward, carrying the body's testimony to the brain rather than the brain's orders to the body, a tide of brain waves going out from fast to slow, a stress hormone falling by nearly half in the very people you would expect it to rise in, a heart learning to vary, to soften, to trust, a pressure easing in the walls of the vessels. Every one of these a separate instrument measured by separate hands, and every one of them pointing the same way. The comfortable old picture, the one where the brain sits on top like a general barking orders down to an obedient body, has not survived the evening. It has been quietly, thoroughly taken apart, and something stranger and far more beautiful has been assembled in its place. A body and a brain in ceaseless conversation, each forever asking the other whether it is safe to stand down. And the astonishing thing, The thing I still turn over in my own mind is that you, lying here doing what looks to the whole world like nothing at all, are the one holding the only phrase in that conversation you can speak on purpose. Let me sit with that for a moment, because it deserves it. You are the one holding the only phrase you can speak on purpose. Every other voice in this long conversation is automatic. The adrenal gland does not deliberate. The reticular formation does not weigh its options. The amygdala does not pause to consider whether it is overreacting. These are old machines running old programs, and they run whether you like it or not. But the muscle, the ordinary muscle in your forearm, in your calf, in the small crease of your brow, that one you can address directly. You can reach into that ancient argument between body and brain and with nothing but a decision change the pitch of one voice. And because the wiring runs the way it runs, because most of the fibers in that great wandering nerve carry their news upward and not downward, changing that one voice changes what every other voice hears. Think about what that means for the loop we uncovered earlier. Remember the shape of it. Worry stiffens the shoulder. The stiff shoulder sends its steady report up the spinal cord, a small insistent telegram that says, something here is braced, something here expects a blow. The brain reads the telegram and concludes sensibly that if the body is braced, there must be something to be braced against, and it tightens its own vigilance to match. That heightened vigilance flows back down and stiffens the shoulder a little more. Around and around it goes, each half feeding the other, and neither half ever quite knows that it started the fire. That is the trap Jacobson glimpsed with his sensitive amplifier all those years ago, when he noticed that a person could lie perfectly still on a couch, and yet, in the electrical whisper of the muscle, be shouting. Now here is the quiet mercy of the whole arrangement. You do not have to break both halves of that loop. You only have to break one, and the loop does the rest of the work for you, running in reverse. Soften the shoulder, truly soften it, down past the place ordinary willing can reach, down to where the tendon organ throws its little switch and the muscle sinks below the level it held before you ever tensed it, and the telegram changes its message. The report going up the cord no longer says braced. It says loose, easy, unguarded. And the brain, which has no window onto the world except the reports it receives, reads the new telegram and draws the only conclusion available to it. If the body has stood down, the danger must have passed. The vigilance eases. The eased vigilance flows back down and permits the next muscle to soften further. The same wheel that carried you into distress now carries you out, turning the other way, and you set it turning with a single deliberate act in a single deliberate muscle. This is why the order of the 16 groups is not an accident and not merely a tidy way to keep from losing your place. You begin at the forehead, at that thin sheet of muscle over the brow that carries so much of our worry without our ever asking it to, and you tense it and you let it fall. Then the eyes and cheeks. Then the jaw, which clenches all night in people who would swear they slept soundly. Then the neck, the shoulders, the long muscles of the back, the chest, the upper arms, the fists, the belly, the hips, the thighs, the calves, and at last the feet. And what you are doing, group by group, is silencing the threat telegram one relay station at a time. Each muscle you release removes its own small voice from the chorus of alarm. When you begin, that chorus is singing in full dozens of muscles, each sending up its steady note of readiness. By the time you reach your feet, you have hushed them one by one, until the cord carries almost no alarm upward at all, and the brain, listening for danger in a body that has fallen quiet in every quarter, finally has nothing to hear. I want you to notice how different this is from the story we were all so comfortable with at the start of the evening. We thought relaxation was subtraction. Take away the effort, and what remains is rest, the way silence is what remains when the music stops. But that is not what is happening here at all. You are not subtracting. You are broadcasting. The relaxed muscle is not a muscle that has been turned off. It is a muscle that has been given a new job, the job of transmitting safety, and it performs that job as actively, as electrically, as loudly in the language the nervous system understands as it ever performed the job of lifting a weight. The scanner told us this in the plainest possible terms. The motor cortex burns just as bright, or brighter, when you let go as when you grip. Letting go is a thing you do, not a thing that happens to you when you stop doing. And there is a further wrinkle, a lovely one, that I have been saving. When you release one hand, the quieting does not stay politely in that hand. It spreads. The inhibition ripples across the motor cortex into the neighborhoods that govern the other limbs, into the forearm map on the far side, damping their readiness too, tightening the little internal brake we call short interval intracortical inhibition in regions you never consciously addressed. So the act of softening your right fist reaches, without your permission and without your knowledge, into your left. One deliberate release becomes many involuntary ones. You strike a single key and a whole chord sounds. This is generosity built into the architecture. The nervous system, once it is persuaded that one corner of the body has stood down, is inclined to extend that verdict outward, to give the rest of you the benefit of the doubt. You need only convince it somewhere, and it will do much of the convincing everywhere else on its own. Now, if all of this happened only in the half hour you lay there and then vanished by morning, it would be a pleasant trick and not much more. A warm bath does as much. But that is not what the numbers showed us. Something lingers. The corticospinal excitability after the release phase does not merely return to where it began. It settles below where it began, a hair quieter than baseline, as though the system, having been shown the way down, decides to stay a little lower. And when people practice this night after night, week after week, the resting state itself begins to migrate. The trapezius that sat clenched at its desk all day learns, slowly, to sit a little slacker. The heart that beat with a metronome's rigid sameness learns to vary again, to breathe a little in its rhythm, which is the very signature of a nervous system that feels safe enough to loosen its grip on the reins. The experienced hand no longer even needs the full ritual. A single cue, a remembered feeling, a breath, and the whole cascade fires in under a minute, cortisol dipping, the brain waves sliding from the sharp, fast chatter toward the slow, broad swells, no fist clenching required at all. The path, walked enough times, wears itself into a road. And a road is a different thing from a path. A path you must find each time. A road is simply there, waiting, whether you are thinking about it or not. That is the rewiring, and I want to be careful and honest about the word, because it is a grand word and grand words are dangerous. Nothing is being soldered. No wire is torn out and laid down anew. What changes is subtler and, to my mind, more remarkable. The system learns a habit. It learns that this configuration of the body, this particular slackness in these particular muscles, is one it has adopted safely many times before, and having learned that, it grows quicker to adopt it, quicker to trust it, quicker to let the alarm fall silent when the first few muscles report that all is well. You are not rebuilding the machine. You are teaching it, by repetition, which of its own states to reach for. And the teacher, the only teacher it will listen to on this particular lesson, is the muscle, because the muscle is the one part of the whole apparatus that answers to your deliberate word. There is something almost comic in it, when you stand back. Here is this enormously sophisticated organ, the brain, capable of language and mathematics and grief and the imagining of galaxies, and it cannot directly command itself to feel safe. You cannot simply decide to be unafraid, as anyone who has ever lain awake trying to decide exactly that will tell you. The command does not take. The fear does not obey the front door, but it will obey the back door. It will obey the slow persuasion that comes up from a body which has, muscle by muscle, quietly laid down its arms. The brain will not be ordered into calm. It can only be convinced of calm, and the muscles are the witnesses whose testimony it cannot dismiss, because it has no way to check their story against any other source. Whatever the body reports, the brain must, in the end, believe. And so the humblest instrument in the whole orchestra, the one you might have thought was merely along for the ride, the tissue that grips and pulls and does the heavy, dull labor of moving you through the world, turns out to hold a vote that even the amygdala cannot overrule. Which brings us, at last, toward a question I have been circling all evening without quite landing on. The question of what all of this costs when it runs the other way. Because if a body deliberately softened can talk a frightened brain down from its perch, then we are obliged to ask the darker version of the same question. Suppose the loop turns, and instead of a body laying down its arms, you have a body that never quite puts them down. Suppose the fist never fully opens. Not in some dramatic way, not a clenched jaw you would notice in a mirror, but a low, steady grip in the shoulders, a faint, permanent hunch in the neck, a forehead that carries a little tension even in sleep. Nothing you would ever call an emotion, just muscle, holding, the way a hand left too long on a railing forgets it is gripping. And here is the uncomfortable thing that Jacobson's little amplifier was already whispering back in that Harvard laboratory, and that the modern instruments have only made louder. That quiet grip is not a harmless leftover. It is a signal. It is being read. And it is being believed. Think about what we established. Roughly 4 out of every 5 fibers in that great wandering nerve run upward, carrying the body's report to the brain rather than the brain's orders to the body. The spindle afferents chatter their proprioceptive news every waking second. The brain, remember, has no window through which to peek directly at your muscles. It knows them only by their testimony. So a muscle that stays a little tightened is a muscle that keeps filing the same report over and over all day, all night. A small persistent memo that reads roughly, "Be ready, something here is not settled." And the brain, having no way to fact-check that memo, does the only sensible thing an organ can do when a trusted source keeps sending the same warning. It stays a little on guard. It keeps the threat detector warm. It leaves a hand resting near the alarm. Now here is the finding that ought to make you sit up, or rather, since this is meant to carry you gently down towards sleep, the finding that ought to make you settle more deeply into the strangeness of it. When researchers measured the chronic resting tension in 2 particular muscles, the trapezius, that broad sheet across the top of the shoulders and up into the neck, and the frontalis, the muscle of the forehead, and then asked which measurement best predicted how anxious a person actually was, the muscle won. The muscle told a truer story than the person did. Resting muscle tension predicted anxiety severity more accurately than self-reported stress, more accurately than how well the person said they slept, more accurately than a careful inventory of the hard events in their life, the losses and the deadlines and the ordinary weight of being alive. The tissue knew before the words did. The shoulders were keeping a ledger the mind had not finished reading. Sit with that for a moment, because it quietly overturns something we almost never question. We are used to thinking of muscle tension as a symptom. Something happens, you feel anxious, and as a kind of downstream side effect your shoulders tighten. The tightening is the smoke, the anxiety is the fire, and no one bothers studying the smoke to understand the fire. But the measurement suggests the arrow does not point only that way. The tightening is not merely a readout of the trouble. It is part of the machinery that keeps the trouble running. It is not only the smoke. It is, in its small way, feeding the flame. Because every hour it holds, it sends its little memo upward. And every memo keeps the brain a fraction more vigilant, and a brain a fraction more vigilant leaves the body a fraction more tensed. And around it goes, quietly, for years, a loop so slow and so soft you would never feel it turning. This is the darker face of the very same principle that makes the tense and release cycle work. It is one mechanism running in 2 directions, and you do not get to have one without the other. The body that can talk a frightened brain down is, unavoidably, the body that can also keep a calm brain faintly afraid. The vote the shoulders hold is a real vote, and a vote that can be cast for peace can be cast just as easily and far more often for a low grinding unease that has no name and no cause you could point to, because its cause is not an idea at all. Its cause is a muscle that forgot how to fully let go. And this, at last, is what Jacobson meant, though I do not think even he saw the whole of it, by that plain little sentence of his that we have been turning over all evening. People can be tense when they are resting, he said, but they cannot be tense when they are relaxed. Hear how carefully that is put. Resting is not relaxing. You can lie perfectly still on a couch, doing nothing, going nowhere, and be, by the honest measure of the amplifier, quite tense. The stillness is a costume. Underneath it, the fibers are shortened, the memos are flying, the brain is standing its quiet watch. Doing nothing is not the same as releasing something, and the whole tradition he founded rests on the difference between those 2 states that look, from the outside, identical. 2 people lie motionless in the dark. One is resting. One is relaxed. Nothing visible tells them apart. but their nervous systems are living in two different worlds, which is why the deliberate cycle is not, as the old contrast story would have it, a mere psychological trick of making the rest feel deeper by comparison. It is something far more mechanical and far more honest than that. When you tense a muscle hard, up toward that threshold of roughly 70% of everything it could give, and you hold it for those several long seconds, you are not putting on a show for the mind. You are loading the tendon. You are driving the little tension sensor at the muscle's end, the Golgi tendon organ, past the point where it can stay quiet, and when it fires, it does not ask the brain's permission. It runs its signal straight into the spinal cord onto an inhibitory cell, and that cell reaches back and switches the muscle's own drive down below the floor it was resting at before. You cannot do that by wanting to. You cannot decide your way underneath your own baseline. The reflex takes you somewhere volition simply cannot reach, which is exactly why the releasing works when the mere ordering of yourself to calm down never does. And that is also why the release is given the longer share of the time, the 20 seconds and more against the 10 of holding, because the softening does not arrive the instant you let go. It seeps. It deepens over the whole slow exhale of the reflex, and if you release and rush on, you leave most of the medicine in the bottle. Do that once, in one muscle, and you have opened a single small valve, but you do not do it once. You walk it up the body, the forehead, then the eyes and cheeks, the jaw, the neck, down across the shoulders and the back, the chest, the arms, the fists, the belly, the hips, the long muscles of the thighs, the calves, the feet, and at every station you file, deliberately, a new report. Released, nothing to guard here, and then here. And now here, one by one, you are silencing the very afferents whose ceaseless low chatter was keeping the brain on watch. You are not arguing with the brain. You are changing the evidence it is reading. You are walking through the whole building, turning off the alarms that were never announcing a real fire, only announcing that a muscle had forgotten to relax. And the deepest part, the part that turns a pleasant 20 minutes into an actual rewiring, is that the nervous system is a learning thing. It notices what keeps happening. Do this night after night, and the brain begins to lay down the association, to build the shortcut, the way your hand learns a doorknob in the dark. The pathway from that first curling of the toes to the flooding of calm gets worn smooth, and worn smoother, until, in people who have practiced a long while, the full ceremony is no longer required at all. The measurements show it plainly. A seasoned practitioner can drop into the changed state, can move the cortisol, can shift the very rhythm of the brainwaves in under a single minute, with only a cue, only a remembered feeling, no clenching required. The tense and release was the scaffolding. The building it raised was a new road between the body and the brain, and once the road is paved, you can travel it at a thought. So the loop that darkened when it ran downward, the shoulders quietly keeping the mind afraid, can be caught and turned, not by force, not by insight, not by talking yourself out of anything, but by climbing down into the tissue where it actually lives and teaching it, one muscle and one long release at a time, how to lay its arms down and leave them down. And the more nights you do it, the less it is a thing you do and the more it becomes a thing you are, a baseline that is quietly moved, a body whose testimony to the brain has changed its tune. Which leaves one last matter to weigh before we let the lights go all the way down, and it is this. Suppose you never learned any of this. Suppose you went your whole life without ever once climbing down into the muscle on purpose. What happens then? The tension does not simply sit there waiting politely. It settles in. It becomes the way you are held. And here is a fact that ought to make you sit up. Except that we want you to lie down, so let me deliver it softly. When the researchers measured the resting electrical chatter in two particular muscles, the flat sheet across the top of the shoulders they call the trapezius, and the broad band across the forehead they call the frontalis, they found something they did not expect. That resting tension, the low hum that never fully switches off, turned out to predict how anxious a person was more accurately than asking them how stressed they felt. More accurately than their sleep. More accurately than the list of hard things that had happened to them in the last year. Think about what that means for a moment. The forehead knew before the questionnaire did. The shoulders were keeping a more honest record than the mind that sat above them. Now, if you had asked almost anyone which way that arrow points, they would have told you the obvious thing. They would have said, of course the anxious person has tight shoulders. The worry comes first and the muscle simply reports it, the way a thermometer reports a fever without causing it. And for a long time that is exactly how it was read. The muscle was the symptom, the mind was the disease. But you have spent this whole long evening watching that tidy little arrow get bent and finally turn all the way around. 80 out of every 100 fibers in that great wandering nerve carry their news upward, from the body into the brain. The spindle in the belly of every muscle never stops whispering its report. And the scanner showed us the forehead and the shoulder are not passive thermometers at all. They are speakers. They are voting. So when a muscle holds its low hum year after year, it is not merely recording the fear. It is, in some real and measurable part, casting a vote for it. It is standing up in the parliament of the nervous system every second of every day and quietly saying, "We are not safe, we are not safe, we are not safe." And no one hears it as words. That is the strange and almost sad part. You do not feel your trapezius filing its report. You do not notice the frontalis raising its small electrical hand. You just feel, vaguely, that the world is a little sharper than it should be, that the phone ringing lands a little harder than it ought to, that you are braced for something you could not name if I asked you. The tension has been translated. By the time it reaches you, it is no longer a muscle. It is a mood. It is a temperament. It is the color the day comes in. And you would swear on anything, that the mood came first and made the shoulders tight. When all along a good share of the traffic was running the other way up the road, the body telling the brain what kind of day to have, and the brain believing it. Because why on earth would it not? There is an old and comfortable idea, and I want to hold it up to the light one more time before we set it down for the night, because we spent the first stretch of this talk building it up as if it were solid. The idea that relaxation is nothing, that it is the absence of a thing, that to relax is simply to stop, the way a machine stops when you cut the power, and that there is nothing to learn and nothing to do, because doing nothing is, after all, the easiest thing in the world. Well, we watched a scanner light up like a city at night while a person lay perfectly still and did, by all appearances, absolutely nothing. The motor cortex? Blazing. The region up front behind the brow that handles your judgment and your planning? Engaged. The old deep knots of tissue near the center that help time your movements? Engaged. The great folded structure at the back that keeps you balanced and smooth? Engaged. All of it working during nothing. Letting go, it turns out, is one of the most active things a brain ever does. It is not the power cutting out. It is a whole crew working the controls to bring a great engine down gently, on purpose, without stalling it and without slamming it. And that reframes the entire evening, does it not? Because if letting go were truly nothing, then it would be free, and it would be automatic, and no one would ever need to be taught it, and there would be no such thing as a person who cannot relax. But there are such people. There are a great many of them. There are people who lie down at the end of a long day and cannot find the switch, who close their eyes and feel the shoulders creep back up toward the ears the instant attention wanders, who have quite genuinely forgotten how to lay their arms down and leave them down. Because it is a skill, and skills that are never practiced grow stiff and far away. That is the quiet tragedy hiding underneath the folk theory. If you believe relaxation is nothing, you will never practice it, and if you never practice it, the road grows over and the muscle keeps casting its vote in the dark, and you call the result your personality. So consider the alternative, the thing you have actually been learning to do. You tense a muscle hard, up around 70 out of every 100 parts of everything it has got, and you hold it while you count slowly to something like 5 or 10. Long enough for that little tension gauge riding at the seam where muscle meets tendon to reach its threshold and fire. And then you release, and you wait, and here is the part people rush and should not. You wait a good long 20 seconds or more, because the reflex that follows is not instant and it is not something you command. It unfolds on its own schedule down in the cord, below the floor of thought, an inhibition that reaches into that muscle and lowers it past the place it started, quieter after the storm than it ever was before the storm. And you do this to the forehead, then the eyes and the cheeks, then the jaw, then down through the neck, the shoulders, the chest, the arms, the fists, the belly, the hips, the thighs, all the way down to the calves and the small muscles that curl your feet. 16 little conversations, each one the same shape. Tense and hold and let the long, slow release do its work. And by the time you reach your feet, you have walked the whole length of the body and at every station told one more crowd of muscles to sit down and stop voting no. And what have you actually accomplished? Down there in the dark, curling your toes like a person doing the silliest and least impressive thing imaginable. You have gone to the source of a signal and turned its volume down at the source. Not argued with the mood. Not talked yourself out of the fear. Not white-knuckled your way toward calm, which never works, because trying hard to relax is a contradiction the body sees straight through. You went underneath all of that, down to the tissue where the alarm is manufactured, and you ease the hand off the alarm. And because 80 out of every 100 of those nerve fibers run upward, the good news travels the same road the bad news always traveled. Up it goes, into the tangle in the brainstem that keeps the balance between the branch of the nervous system that revs you and the branch that settles you, and the balance tips gently towards settling. Up further into the cortex, where within minutes the very texture of the electrical weather begins to change, the anxious fast rhythm thinning out, the calm slower rhythm rising like a tide. And further still, to that small deep almond of tissue whose whole job is to scan for threat, and it reads the incoming reports, and finds that every line is now saying the same thing. The shoulders say it, the jaw says it, the belly says it, the breath says it, and against that chorus even the threat detector has to concede. All clear. Stand down. You did that. Lying still, doing, to any eye watching, nothing at all. Now I said there was one last matter to weigh, and I have been circling it, so let me set it right in the middle of the table where you can see it. It is this. If the body can teach the brain to be afraid, quietly for years, without either of them ever putting it into words, then the question is not really whether you can undo that. You have seen that you can. The question is what it means that so much of what we call our inner life has been getting written from the outside in, all along, by a set of muscles we were never taught to read. And it means that a good part of the mind you think of as yours, fixed, given, the way you simply are, may be a habit the body is keeping, and habits, unlike fates, can be changed by anyone willing to lie down in the quiet and practice. Consider what practice really is, though, because I have been using the word as if we all agree on it, and I do not think we do. When you practice a thing, you are not merely getting better at doing it. You are teaching your nervous system that a certain doorway exists, and where it is, and how to find the handle in the dark. The first time you tense your hand and let it go and feel that strange sinking warmth, the whole business takes a while, and you have to think about it, and you almost do not believe anything happened. But do it every evening for a few weeks, and something quietly changes about the doorway itself. It gets easier to find. And then, and this is the part I find genuinely lovely, you reach a point where you no longer need the tensing at all. There are people who have practiced this long enough that they can sit down, close their eyes, and simply call the feeling up. No fist, no clenched jaw, no holding for 10 seconds and letting go. They think a kind of cue, a word or an image they have paired with the sinking 1,000 times, and the cortisol begins to fall, and the brainwaves begin to slide toward that calm alert alpha, and it all happens in under a minute, under 60 seconds from a thought. Now that ought to stop you for a moment, because the tense and release cycle, the whole spinal reflex machinery we spent so long admiring, the Golgi organ, the 20-second release, all of that was the scaffolding. It was how you got the building up. Once the building stands, you can walk in through the front door without the scaffolding at all. The muscles taught the brain a route, and then the brain learned to travel that route on its own. This is what I mean by rewiring, and I want to be careful not to make it sound like more than it is. It is not magic, and it is not permanent in the way a scar is permanent. It is a conditioned pathway, the same plain kind of learning that lets a musician's fingers find a chord without being told, or let you catch a falling glass before you have decided to reach for it. You have paired a cue with a physiological state so many times that the cue alone now summons the state. The tensing was the teacher. The recall is the graduate who no longer needs the teacher in the room. And here is a thing that follows from it, which people almost never say out loud. If you can learn the calm this way, by pairing and repetition until it comes on cue, then you almost certainly learn the fear the same way. Nobody set you down and taught you to hold your shoulders up around your ears. Nobody gave you a lesson in clenching your jaw while you slept. You practiced it. 10,000 small afternoons of low worry, each one a repetition, each one pairing some ordinary moment with a quiet tightening until the tightening came on its own, unbidden, as its own kind of recall. The anxious body is not broken. It is superbly well trained. It has simply been rehearsing the wrong piece. Let me put a hard number against that, because I promised you I would keep the numbers honest. And there is one here that I think is among the strangest in this whole story. When researchers measured the resting tension in certain muscles, the trapezius across the top of the shoulders, the frontalis across the brow, the ones that carry worry without being asked, they found that this baseline muscular tension predicted how anxious a person was. That by itself is not shocking. But it predicted anxiety better than the person's own report of their stress, better than how they rated their sleep, better than a careful inventory of the hard things that had happened in their life, the losses and the moves and the troubles. The dumb electrical hum of a shoulder muscle at rest told you more about the state of a mind than the mind could tell you about itself. Sit with that, gently, the way you would sit with a puzzle you are not in a hurry to solve. We tend to think we are the best witnesses to our own condition, that if anyone knows how anxious I am, it is me. And here is a muscle, a slab of tissue that cannot speak, that has never had a thought, keeping a more accurate record than the part of me that does the thinking. The body is not just a symptom of the trouble. On this evidence, the body is closer to the ledger than the narrator is. The muscle is not reporting the anxiety. In some real sense, the muscle is holding it. Now, I do not want you to drift off tonight believing this has all been settled and stamped and filed, because it has not, and I would be doing you a disservice to pretend otherwise. When people gathered up the studies on this whole practice, dozens of them, and looked at them together with a cold eye, they found something worth admitting. Most of those studies leaned on what people said about themselves. Questionnaires. Rating scales. Did you feel less anxious? On a line from 1 to whatever. And those scales moved. They moved a great deal, in the direction you would hope. But only a smaller number of studies went and measured the hard physical things, the actual variability in the heartbeat, the actual electrical brainwaves, the actual cortisol in the spit, the actual markers of inflammation in the blood. And a good third of the studies were small. Fewer than 40 people. Which is not nothing, but it is not a mountain either. I tell you this not to talk you out of anything. I tell you because the honest way to hold a piece of knowledge is to hold it by the handle it actually has, not the handle you wish it had. What we can say with real confidence is that when you measure the body directly, and a few good studies did, the needle moves the right way and moves clearly. The heartbeat's fine flickering variability climbs, which is the mark of the calm branch of the nervous system taking the wheel. The cortisol falls in one careful trial by nearly half, while the people who did nothing watched theirs climb. The sweat glands quiet down in a smooth, steady line as you go, which is about as direct a readout of the alarm system standing down as we have ever managed to get. And curiously, in that same careful comparison, the plain, deep breathing that everyone recommends did something a little more complicated. The sweating spiked first, a small surprise of arousal, before it settled. The muscle work did not spike. It went down and kept going down in a clean falling line from the first minute to the last. That detail matters more than it looks, so let me linger on it. When they set the muscle practice beside other calming methods and watched the heartbeat over many weeks, it was the muscle practice specifically that lifted the heart's variability. A breathing method tuned to the body's natural rhythm, which by every reasonable expectation should have won, did essentially nothing to that particular measure. Nothing you could tell from noise. So this is not a case of, oh, any relaxing thing will do, they are all the same, pick your favorite. Something about the tensing and the releasing, something about going in through the muscle and the tendon and the spinal reflex reaches a part of the machinery that a slow breath, for all its virtues, does not reach in the same way. The door through the muscle is a real door, and it is not the same door as the others. And I keep coming back, in my own mind, to why the door should be there at all. Why should squeezing a fist and letting it go have any business touching the chemistry of fear? And the answer, the one we built together out of the wreckage of the tidy top-down story, is that the traffic was never one way. The overwhelming share of the fibers in that great wandering nerve, the vagus, the one everybody draws with its arrows pointing down from the brain into the guts, run the other direction. Up. From the body to the brain. Something like 4 out of every 5 of them are not carrying orders down. They are carrying reports up. And what are they reporting? The state of things. How is the belly? How is the heart? And underneath all of it, from the muscles, a ceaseless murmur. Are we tense? Are we ready? Is there something to brace against? That murmur never stops. It runs while you sleep. It runs while you read. It is the background hum against which the brain decides minute by minute whether the world is safe. So when you lie in the dark and go through your muscles one by one, the forehead, the eyes, the jaw, the neck, the shoulders, all the way down through the belly and the hips and the thighs to the feet, you are not performing a relaxation exercise in the way you might do a few stretches. You are reaching into that upward murmur and, group by group, turning down the volume on the part of it that has been quietly voting danger. Each muscle you release removes one voice from the chorus that has been telling the brain to stay ready. And the brain, which is only ever adding up the votes, begins to get a different tally. Fewer voices for threat, more silence, which it reads correctly as the absence of threat. You are not arguing with your fear. You cannot argue with fear. You are quietly, one muscle at a time, retiring the witnesses who kept testifying against your peace. Let me stay with that image for a while, because there is something in it worth turning over slowly. The witnesses who kept testifying against your peace. When Jacobson sat in his laboratory in Chicago through the 1930s and 40s, running his low microvoltage apparatus, watching those tiny needles flicker at the faintest tightening of a forearm, he was really watching testimony. Every microvolt was a small statement. The muscle was saying, "I am holding." And the brain was hearing it. Jacobson spent something like 20 years after that first Harvard demonstration before he was willing to publish, and I think part of the reason is that what he was finding did not fit the picture anyone wanted. He kept measuring people who believed they were relaxed, who felt relaxed, who would have told you honestly that they were doing nothing at all and the needle would not go to zero. There was always a little current, a little holding, a residual voice in the chorus that the person could not even hear. And that is the strange and quiet fact at the center of all this. You can feel relaxed and still be tense. The feeling and the state are not the same thing. Your sense of your own body is not a precise instrument. It is more like a rumor. It tells you roughly what is going on, and it rounds off the small stuff, and the small stuff is exactly what has been keeping the alarm warm. This is why the deliberate tensing matters so much. When you squeeze a muscle hard, at something like 70% of everything it can give, for 5 or 10 seconds, you are not relaxing. You are doing the opposite. But you are doing the opposite on purpose, with your attention fully on it, and that act of pushing the tension all the way up does 2 things at once. It trips that spinal off switch we talked about, the tendon organ firing its inhibitory message into the cord. And it also, and this is the part people miss, it shows your rumor machine where the muscle actually is. You cannot find the resting tension by looking for it. It is too quiet. But you can find it by contrast, by first making it loud and then letting it fall and feeling how much farther down it goes than you expected. The release teaches your attention the true floor of the muscle, a floor it did not know was there. So the folk theory was not entirely wrong. There is a contrast at work, but the contrast is not psychological comfort, not merely rest feeling nicer after effort. The contrast is a measurement. You are calibrating your own perception against the real state of the fibers and closing the gap between the rumor and the fact. And once that gap is closed, once you can actually feel the residual holding, you can let it go. You cannot release what you cannot detect. Half of what PMR does is not relaxation at all. It is detection. It is turning up the resolution on your own body until the quiet voices become audible, and only then can you retire them. Think for a moment about how odd that is compared to the way we usually imagine improving at something. Usually getting better means gaining a skill, adding something, building a capacity you did not have. Here, getting better means losing something. It means learning to stop doing an effort you did not know you were making. The trapezius up along the top of the shoulders, the frontalis across the brow, these are muscles that in a great many people simply never fully switch off. They hold a small guard all day and often all night. And the remarkable finding is that the resting electrical activity in those two muscles, measured directly, predicts a person's anxiety better than asking them how stressed they feel, better than their sleep, better than counting up the hard things that happened to them that year. The shoulders keep a more honest record than the mind does. The mind forgets, rationalizes, tells itself it is fine. The trapezius just keeps holding, and the needle keeps reading, and the number does not lie. I find that almost unbearably interesting, and I want you to sit with it as you lie there. Somewhere in your body right now, there is a muscle keeping a tally you are not aware of. Not because anything is wrong with you, because that is what bodies do. They remember with tension. They store the leftover readiness from 100 small moments that never quite resolved, the phone call you braced for, the stare you nearly missed, the conversation that ended without ending. Each one asked a muscle to get ready, and the readiness came, and then the moment passed, but nobody sent the all clear. The muscle was never told it could stand down. So it kept a little of the charge, and another moment added a little more. And over months and years, the small charges accumulate into a resting tone that feels, from the inside, simply like being yourself. It feels like you're normal. You do not experience it as tension, you experience it as who you are. And this is where the tense and release cycle does its quiet subversion. Because when you squeeze that muscle deliberately and then let it fall past its old floor, you are in effect sending the all clear that never came. You are finishing 100 unfinished moments at once. Not by remembering them, not by understanding them. You do not need to know what the muscle was holding or why. The tendon organ does not care about the story. It only cares about the tension, and when the tension drops, it opens the gate, and the muscle sinks below the baseline it had defended for years. You have, without a single word, told the body that the emergency, whatever it was, is over. And because most of the vagal traffic runs upward, from body to brain, that message does not stay local. It travels. The brain, sampling the body as it always does, notices that a region which had been reporting a low steady readiness has gone quiet. One region. Then, as you move through the sequence, another. Then another. Now here is a thing I want to be careful and honest about, because it would be easy to oversell. We do not fully know how permanent any single session is. What the studies show is that within a session, the electrodermal activity slides steadily downward, the skin's sympathetic sweat response withdrawing in a clean line as the minutes pass. We know that across 3 weeks of daily practice, the cortisol comes down and stays down while on untreated groups cortisol climbs. We know that across 4 weeks, the blood pressure settles by several points and the heart rate eases. We know that across many weeks, the heart rate variability, that beat-to-beat flexibility which marks a calm and responsive nervous system, rises measurably in people who do the muscle work and not in people who only breathe. But the deep question, the honest question, of exactly how a temporary state becomes a permanent trait, of how many repetitions it takes to move the baseline and not just the moment, that question does not have a clean number attached to it yet. The systematic reviews say so plainly. Too many of the studies are small. Too many lean on questionnaires rather than on cortisol and brainwaves and heart rhythms. The direction of the effect is not in doubt. The precise dose is. But we can say something about the mechanism of permanence even without the exact bookkeeping, and it is this. Every time you run the cycle and feel the muscle drop below where it was, you are not only relaxing that muscle, you are laying down a memory of the transition. You are teaching your nervous system the route from tense to loose, from guarded to open, and like any route walked often enough, it gets easier to find. The first time, you need the whole ritual, the full squeeze, the long slow release of 20 seconds or more, the deliberate march through 16 muscle groups. But after enough repetitions, something economical happens. The system learns the destination and stops needing the full road to get there. The experienced practitioner can call up a good part of the shift with a cue alone, no hard squeeze required, and the cortisol and the brain waves move within a minute. That is not magic. That is a path worn smooth. That is the difference between working out a route with a map and simply knowing the way home in the dark. So when you ask what is being rewired, that is the honest answer, not the muscle. The muscle was always able to relax. What is being rewired is the connection between the intention and the state, the reliability with which a small, quiet decision to let go can actually reach down and be obeyed. In an untrained body, that connection is faint and unreliable. The command to relax goes out and mostly gets lost in the noise of all that residual holding. In a trained body, the connection is a well-lit corridor, and the command arrives and the body answers. You are not building a new muscle. You are building a better wire between the part of you that wants peace and the part of you that has been quietly refusing it. And I think that reframes the whole exercise. It is not a technique for producing calm on a particular difficult night, though it does that. It is a slow renegotiation of the terms on which your body decides, moment by moment, whether to be afraid. Every session shifts those terms a little, lowers the threshold of proof the body demands before it will let itself be safe. Lying there curling and releasing your toes, tightening and dropping your calves, you are not merely soothing yourself for tonight. You are, in the smallest and most physical way imaginable, arguing for a different default and winning the argument not with reasons, but with evidence the body cannot dispute. Because the evidence is the body itself. Gone quiet, one honest muscle at a time. And here is the last thing I want to leave with you, because I think it is the quietest and the strangest part of the whole business. We began tonight with a body lying still on a couch, and we called that relaxation. And we thought we understood it. We thought calm was a subtraction. Take away the effort, take away the noise, and what remains is peace. But that was never quite true. The body on the couch, the one that looks like it is doing nothing, may be full of small held tensions it does not even feel anymore. The jaw that will not fully let go, the shoulders sitting a little higher than they need to, the brow that carries a faint crease into sleep. These are not dramatic. They are the ordinary background hum of a nervous system that has forgotten there is another way to be. And the muscle spindles keep sending their little reports upward, and the reticular formation keeps reading those reports, and the balance tips ever so slightly toward vigilance. Not fear exactly, just readiness. Just a body that never quite finished the day. Now think about what the tensing actually accomplishes. It seems almost backward, doesn't it? That to teach a muscle to be soft, you first make it hard. But that is the trick, and it is a beautiful one. You cannot easily let go of something you cannot feel. The chronic tension is invisible precisely because it is chronic. It has become the flaw, the zero, the thing you measure everything else against. So you take that muscle, and you push it to about 70% of everything it has, and you hold it there for a count of maybe 5 or 10 seconds. And now the tension is enormous, undeniable, right there in the front of your attention. You have made the invisible visible, and when you release, the Golgi tendon organ at the muscle tendon junction, that little tension gauge with its type 1B fibers running back into the spinal cord, has already crossed its threshold, and it fires its quiet command through the inhibitory interneurons, and it switches the motor neurons off below the level where your will alone could ever reach. The muscle sinks past the floor you thought was the bottom, and you feel it go. That is the whole thing, right there. Not the tension, and not the rest, but the going, the actual felt event of a muscle traveling from held to free. And when you string 16 of those together, forehead down to the feet, one honest group at a time, you are not soothing 16 separate places. You are conducting a full-body proprioceptive census. You are asking every muscle in turn to report in and then to stand down. And each one that stands down removes a little of that upward threat signal, and the brain, which we now know is listening far more than it is speaking, since something like 80% of those vagal fibers run from the body up to the head and not the other way, the brain slowly changes its estimate. It revises the number. It decides, on the accumulating physical evidence, that perhaps tonight there is nothing to guard against after all. The thing I find almost moving, if a physicist is allowed to say so, is that this is not a trick you perform on yourself once and then it is done. Jacobson spent 20 years past that first afternoon at Harvard chasing the same small currents through his sensitive amplifier. Because the truth he found was not a single fact but a relationship, and relationships have to be tended. Each session you do this, the corridor between intention and muscle gets a little better lit. The cortisol comes down. The high beta chatter of an anxious brain gives way gradually to the smoother alpha of calm attention, and later, if you go deep enough, to the slow theta of the edge of sleep. The heart's variability climbs, which is the heart's own way of saying it trusts the moment. And none of these are things you command. They are things you permit, by giving the body the one kind of proof it cannot argue with, which is the direct sensation of its own tension leaving. So consider as you lie there in the dark what you have really been doing all these nights. The old story said the brain is the general and the body is the army, that the command flows down and the flesh obeys. And there is truth in that. The general is real. But we have watched the scanner, and we have seen the motor cortex light up as brightly during release as during effort, and we have caught the disinhibition gate opening in the last 100 milliseconds before a muscle lets go, and we have learned that letting go is not silence, but a whole coordinated act of the brain. And we have seen the arrows on the vagus nerve, so many of them, pointing the wrong way, upward from the body toward the mind. Which means the army has a vote. The body is not only obeying, it is also testifying constantly about whether the world is safe, and the brain, whether it likes it or not, is bound to listen. And that, I think, is why staying tense costs so much more than it seems to. A clenched jaw is not free. A shoulder held high all day is not free. Each one is a small voice murmuring upward, hour after hour, that danger is near, and the brain believes its own body, and it keeps the whole stress machine idling. The hypothalamus ready with its corticotropin-releasing hormone, the adrenal glands ready with their cortisol, the heart ready to run. You pay for that readiness in the coin of your own calm, and you pay it without ever seeing the bill. What the tense and release does is let you, deliberately, for a few minutes, send a different message. To become, on purpose, your own evidence of safety. To let the body cast its vote, one relaxed muscle at a time, in favor of peace instead of alarm. Nothing about this is mystical. It is muscle and tendon and nerve and a few chemicals arranged by a long, patient stretch of evolution into a loop that runs in both directions at once. But I would gently suggest that understanding the mechanism does not shrink the wonder of it. It grows it, because it means the thing you have been reaching for, the quiet, the ease, the sense that you're allowed to stop guarding, is not somewhere far away waiting to be found. It was never anywhere but here, folded into the same fibers that hold you upright all day, waiting only for you to notice them, to squeeze them once honestly, and then deliberately to let them go. And in that letting go, without a single word spoken, the oldest argument you have ever had with yourself finally, for a little while, comes to rest. Good night. Curl your toes, and let them fall, and let the quiet have the last word.